Okay, great. We'll be starting momentarily, so just hold on for one moment. And today we will be talking about the living daylights. So just, we will start in about a few minutes. So, okay, great. So just hold on tight and we will begin momentarily. So excuse me while I take a sip of water. And I hope all of you are doing well today. Great. And hopefully the sound and the picture quality is okay. So if you can just let me know, I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much. Great, we'll begin momentarily. Great, thank you. Picture's fine. Is the sound good? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, just a quick reminder, today is a discussion of the James Bond film, the Eon series of James Bond films from 1987. This is the film The Living Daylights. And so I look forward to talking to you about this very interesting James Bond film. So just hold on tight for another minute or so, and we will begin shortly. So I see Mike Eli is here, John Joseph, Joseph de Jesus, underrated Bond movie in my opinion. Yes, I'm a huge fan of this, so I'm looking forward to this discussion very much. Zyrother is here, hello. Wolfgratz, hi day, sips his Diet Coke. And the picture's quite, thank you very much. Erwin, hello, it's nice to see you. Mainly Movies, our dear friend is here, hello. Alan Finlay is here, top 5 Bond movie for me. Love Dalton's Bond. Yes, me too. I'm looking forward to sharing some comments I have about Dalton's performance in this particular film. I think it's actually absolutely spectacular, and I look forward to that discussion. I look forward to your thoughts about that as well. Thank you very much, Alan. And Alan is here as well. Thank you. Negrello from, I hope you're well, my friend. And let's see. Cooper Glover 1972 is here. Hello. Hulkeract is here. Andre is here. Hello. And Erwin says, I saw The Living Daylights again earlier today, and it was a real treat. Great. And number 10 in my all-time James Bond list. That's very good. Great, great. It's very high on my list as well. And so I look forward to just sharing some thoughts that I have about this very exciting work. John Glenn directed film starring Timothy Dalton, Mariam Dabo, Erwin Krabbe, Jodan Baker, and others, of course. So looking forward to this very much. Yeah, this is going to be very exciting. So, John Rhys Davis and Andres Wisniewski, so as Necros and Pushkin and Necros respectively. So, but in any event, yeah, this is going to be very exciting. So anyway, let us begin. So greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I'm here with yet another live stream. This time, this is the parallel live stream series, I suppose, wherein we will be talking about the James Bond movies. And so last time, I think it was about a couple weeks ago, I think, I had the great opportunity to speak to you about some thoughts that I had about the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And rather than go in order, I've decided just to go in a sort of random order, just to keep things interesting and just keep them a little bit lively. Again, I'm not sure if I'll be able to go through the entire film series, which is why I'm not going chronologically, or one of the reasons why I'm not going chronologically, but I'll try to hit all the films that I can as best as I can and as much as possible, hopefully with the aim of trying to get as many discussed on this channel in this live stream format as possible. But so I just ask for your patience, and I beg your forgiveness for those of you who would prefer to talk about these films in chronological order. I apologize, but I hope you can understand. This is, I think, just my way of trying to keep it lively and to keep it just interesting, I suppose, just going forward. But with the aim, of course, or with the understanding that I will try to go through all of them. But in that spirit, let me now direct my attention to this film, which is The Living Daylights, starring Timothy Dalton and directed by John Glenn, with a screenplay credited to Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson, also starring Mariam Dabo and Herwin Krabe and others. And so this is a very excellent James Bond film, in my opinion. I've grown up watching James Bond films, and I am now 41 years of age. And so I was a child of the 80s. I grew up in the 80s, and one of the first Bond films I ever saw as a kid, or remember seeing as a kid, was The Living Daylights. And this is one of the first films that I remember as being a new James Bond film when I was growing up. And so even now, when I look back on this film, I think of it like a new James Bond film, in that sort of interesting way we look back on our lives and the films that we watch as a kid and growing up. So this is always a kind of fresh film for me. And I think I saw it when I was young as a kid, and maybe at a very impressionable age. And so 1987 was when it was released, so maybe I saw it around 87, 88, something like that, which would have made me, 8 or 9 years old, maybe a little bit older perhaps, I'm not sure, but yeah, around 8 or 9 years old. So that means that's a very impressionable age to watch a film like this, starring Timothy Dalton. And there was a lot of interesting press, I think, at the time about how this was a new Bond actor. But also, for those of you who've seen the film, you'll know that there are other aspects of this film that make it, I think, fresh and stand out and stand apart from the Bond films that preceded it. Not to take anything away from the Bond films that preceded it, just full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of Roger Moore's James Bond films. I love those films. And even the so-called weaker films in the Roger Moore era, I still adore very much. And it will be my great pleasure one of these days to try to address as many of the Roger Moore films as possible, because I really do think that they're so worth it. But I think I think with that era of Bond, here we have undoubtedly a new era being ushered in. There are some elements, of course, that remain consistent, and I'll try to address those to the best of my ability as well. But at the same time, I think there is a lot to be said about how this is setting forth something new and fresh and exciting. And so I think this is going to be an exciting discussion for me. I'm certainly looking forward to it, and so I'm very much looking forward to this. So with that in mind, my friends, let us get the preliminary stuff out of the way, and then we can proceed in earnest with this discussion of this film. And so the preliminary comments that I make with all live streams is that, well, first of all, I should say that I will be speaking about this film in detail, in specific detail, plot details, narrative details, etc. And so if you haven't seen the film, as always, I would strongly suggest that you turn off this live stream right now and try to catch up with this film The Living Daylights. It is a fantastic, exciting James Bond film, well worth it. I mean, it's not perfect, and I think there are some things that I will try to address as well in terms of its imperfections, but I think its real positive points outweigh any imperfections that it might have, and so it's overall a really thrilling, exciting film. So if you haven't seen it yet, then I strongly suggest that you watch it, because it's really a lot of fun. And also, I don't want to spoil any of the surprises in store for you upon seeing this for the first time. So you can always come back to this live stream as a video, because it should be uploaded automatically to YouTube, onto this YouTube channel after the live stream is over. So you can always come back at any time. And so at that point, it'll be my pleasure to hear your thoughts about this film, The Living Daylights. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I should say that as always, I don't come at this as a specific expert in this particular film, or a scholar or an academic who has studied this film. So I don't claim to know absolutely everything about this work. I do know this film based off of the various DVD and Blu-ray supplements that I've been able to see. You know, this is the DVD here. I also have this, which is the Japanese release of the Blu-ray set. You know, the other release of the Blu-ray set, which has a case room for the film Spectre, which I also got and I put in there as well. So it includes The Living Daylights, and so I've seen it on this, I've seen it on that. I've also seen it many times as a kid growing up on VHS tape and the like. And so, but I don't. I'm not a scholar in this film, but I do come at this film as someone who's seen it a number of times, and so I will, including a lot of the supplements, and so I'll try to base my comments off of that fan perspective experience. But with that, of course, I don't claim to know everything about this film, and so I can't necessarily answer every single question about this film, but I'll certainly try my best. But if I can't answer any question that you have about this film, please accept my apologies in advance. But there's already been a lot of reviews and essays and scholarship about the James Bond films, and this film in particular, and so I'm sure you can find somewhere online on the internet, some website that could hopefully answer some of the questions that you might have that I wouldn't otherwise be able to answer. But okay, so there's that, and then also the live chat area is free and open for you to discuss this film or any other film you want, and so that's perfectly fine. And I'm always happy to entertain any comments that are praising this film. I'm also happy to entertain comments that are critical of this film. You know, I'm perfectly fine with receiving comments that are of a critical nature, and I'm not offended by that at all. In fact, I think that's very healthy and that's very rewarding and very constructive. So if you want to speak about this film, how you feel about it, I think that's the most important thing, and just expressing how it is you feel about this particular work. And as always, I just say that, I just ask that I've been very fortunate with this particular YouTube channel, and that I've met a lot of people along the way who have been very courteous and who have always shown me a great deal of respect. Even when we might disagree, you've always shown me a great deal of respect, and I've always been very grateful to that. You know, and we always remain cordial and friendly. And so I trust all of you to maintain that sense of sort of cordial, friendly banter and discussion in the live chat. I know I can trust you and count on you for that, and we can always respect everyone's opinions here. Again, we don't have to agree on everything, but we will always respect each other's opinions, and I know I can rely on you, my dear friends, for that, as I always do, and as you always have shown me that lovely, lovely courtesy. So thank you very much, and I continue to rely on you for that going forward. So thank you very much, my friends. And lastly, I should say that if you have any questions or comments for me, during the live chat. Again, I'll try to address all of the questions, and I'll try to address everyone who's here to the best of my ability. If I miss a question or a comment or someone in the live chat, my apologies. It's not my intention. It's just I do my best, but sometimes I accidentally miss a comment, unintentional, but sometimes it's very hard for me to keep up exactly. Because it's just me running the show, so to speak, and so I have to speak, and then I look to the live chat and I read the comments, but in that process I sometimes miss a comment or miss mentioning someone's name. If that happens to you, I sincerely apologize. It's not my intention, but I hope you can understand, and I will certainly do my best to keep up with the chat. And also about that, if you have any questions for me about this film, that's great, and as I say, I'll do my best to answer. But if you have any questions or comments directed towards me about anything other than this film, The Living Daylights, thank you very much for expressing an interest in what it is I have to say. I'm always very honored about that, as always. But I must respectfully ask, or just ask for your understanding, that I won't be addressing anything directly about anything other than the film The Living Daylights, and maybe some peripheral stuff about other James Bond films, because I do want to make some very brief, minor points about other James Bond films in the context of this film. But my primary focus will be on The Living Daylights, and so if you have any questions or comments for me about anything other than The Living Daylights, please, I ask for your understanding, but I won't be talking about those today. If you can always leave a comment on this video or maybe on any other video after the fact, and hopefully you know by now that I will certainly do my best to get back to you and to give you my response to your particular questions. So there are always ways to reach me if you really wanted to do so. But with that in mind, my friends, let us speak about this film. Again, the John Glenn directed, Richard Baybaum, Michael G. Wilson penned film starring Timothy Dalton in his first debut outing, cinematic outing, as James Bond 007. And as I say, I should mention once again that as a child of the 80s, this was one of the earliest films in the James Bond series that I remember seeing that was new and fresh. And this, and a couple years later, I remember seeing License to Kill. And so I was, again, a young boy watching those films. And then I also saw some of the other films that preceded this. View to a Kill, of course, is the one that came immediately prior to this. So I remember those are the films that I knew growing up and that were new to me, in the sense that I can remember having memories of understanding that these films were emerging into the market as new films at the time. And so now I look back on them as being very special, because these were the first sort of new Bond films that emerged in the theater markets that I grew to know and ended up loving. And I think I mentioned the story about how my mother and father and I, when I was a little boy, we were on holiday somewhere, and it was a sort of a beautiful, maybe sunny resort area. And there was a hotel, and I think my mother and father wanted to go out, maybe to the beach or to the pool or whatever it was. I forget exactly what. But I remember the hotel room had, as part of its sort of a television entertainment, it wasn't like today where you have a vast array of channels and entertainment, but there were movie channels, I think, but it was a very limited kind of schedule. This was in the late 80s, and so but there was a schedule of films that was being played on the television system that was set up in that particular hotel. And I remember The Living Daylights was one of the films that was scheduled to be played on a particular schedule. And so I remember insisting on staying in the hotel room. I think my mother and father wanted all of us to go out to the beach or to the pool or something, because it was beautiful, beautiful weather. But I said, no, I want to stay in the hotel. We were in this European country, wherever we were, and we were on holiday, and it was a beautiful resort place. But I was very young and so much into the excitement of the James Bond films that I insisted on staying in the hotel room. So I stayed in the hotel room by myself while my parents were out that day, wherever they were. And then I just watched The Living Daylights on this TV, and I just absolutely fell in love with it. I fell in love with all the style and the coolness factor. I thought the Aston Martin scene, when Bond and Kara are leaving Bratislava and they're trying to make their way across the border into Vienna, or to Austria, and then they're trying to make their way into Vienna. And so I think it was, and that seeing all the return of the Aston Martin, or not, I mean, at the time I didn't realize it was the return of the Aston Martin, but now thinking back, looking at the series as a whole, we see the return of the Aston Martin, the V8, this time it's a slightly different model, of course, the V8 Vantage, but still, it has been a long time since we had seen an Aston Martin, and so it was a really great thing to see it back in action, as it were, in a really glorious scene involving the winterized version, as Q reminded us, and seeing it in action was really great. But that wasn't all. It was just having a really wonderful, cool music track. John Barry's musical score rises to the occasion once again. And of course, no one necessarily knew it at the time, I suppose, but this ended up being John Barry's last contribution to the musical world of James Bond. But that being the case, what a way to go out. He's even there, of course, at the end of the film. You can see him conducting the orchestra as Kara Malovi on cello is there performing the Tchaikovsky, and so it's nice to see him there. Again, we had no way of knowing, of course, at the time that this would be the last John Barry score. But the point that I wanted to raise at the very beginning was that there was a coolness factor to this, from my point of view, watching this as a little boy, 8, 9 years old, and seeing the cool cars and the cool music, or hearing the cool music, and not necessarily getting the plot. And I'll try to get into this later, because the plot itself, I thought, it was kind of confusing. I wasn't necessarily sure what was going on at the time, but it didn't quite matter. I think the plot elements involving the purchase of the opium, the plan between Whitaker and Koskov to essentially embezzle or abscond with the Russian state funds. I think it was, what did Pushkin say? It was 50. He said 50 million. He said dollars was still sitting in the Swiss bank account of Whitaker for 8 weeks. So I'm assuming that the amount of money was 50 million US dollars. At least that was the currency that Pushkin says. But of course, the plot, we understand later, was about that money, which was intended to be used to purchase arms from Whitaker, the arms dealer, was instead going to be used in secret by Koskov and Whitaker in cahoots to purchase opium, which would then be sold to, I think the idea was it was going to be sold in the US or whatever the market was, and the idea was that it could be sold for 500 million US dollars, and so they'd make a huge profit, and then still be able to take a chunk of that that would have been used as the down payment for the sample of arms to Whitaker, which would then have been used by Whitaker for him to make the purchases of whatever arms that the Russian government was seeking to purchase, etc. And so the whole idea essentially is that this rogue general Koskov is essentially making do with the money as he wishes in order to make this side deal of purchasing opium and then later selling it. So he's essentially a drug dealer, and then he would then put the down payment back, and that would be used in the transaction between Whitaker and the Russian government, and no one would ever know. So that was the whole plan, right? But it was all very convoluted, right? Because what was this whole thing about Smirtspionem, at the whole first half of the film, and death to spies, of course, and the death of 004 during the training exercise at the Rock of Gibraltar, and the intrigue involving the defection of Koskov to the West, and then he's later seemingly apprehended by the KGB, who ends up not being the KGB, but ends up being Nekros, who is in fact one of the henchmen in cahoots with Whitaker and Koskov, and this really kind of confusing plan. And then to top it off, this idea of a fake shooting of Pushkin, and then this whole idea of their whole plot of the defection at the beginning was really, and Smert was really just to sort of drum up support from the British government to have them send James Bond to kill Pushkin, and once Pushkin was out of the way, then Whitaker and Koskov would be free to push through the opium diamond deal. Suddenly diamonds are in the question, so we can assume, therefore, that the purchase of the opium, which we understand later is to be made from the Snow Leopard Brotherhood in Afghanistan, and that is to be the opium is to be purchased, and it's going to be shipped off somewhere, and then it will be sold, and then the money that is used as the proceeds will then be pocketed by Koskov and Whitaker, with some of the proceeds then going towards the original down payment made by the Russian government to pay for whatever samples of arms that they were going to buy from Whitaker. Okay, so it's just trying to explain that. That's all very, very complicated, extremely complicated. And I'll try to talk about that a little bit more, because that's actually one of the most interesting aspects of this film. The fact that it's a kind of a complex plot, made even more complex by the fact it's set against the backdrop of the then current Soviet-Afghan war. And it's still the then current Cold War, because there was still a Cold War going on, and there was a Soviet-Afghan war going on. And if we think about that, and you think about essentially the Soviet Union was essentially in a military struggle with forces in Afghanistan, we realize that there was a whole web of sort of intrigue and geopolitical alliances and strategic alliances that are just all over the place when we're talking about this film. I mean, but I'll try to talk about that later. But I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this work, I think, is the geopolitical aspect of this. But just stepping back a little bit from that, and I'll try to get into more detail later. This film had so many things about it that really confused me as a little boy. But if we were to think of all that plot stuff as, in essence, a kind of, what's the phrase that Alfred Hitchcock would use, a MacGuffin, that thereby, in other words, all that stuff is really not as important as the stuff in front. In other words, Bond battling the bad guys, and meeting Kara, and trying to figure out what's going on, and then getting into situations, escaping from the Afghan airbase, or the Russian airbase, and getting in touch with Kamran Shah, and then trying to get on board the plane, and all that stuff, and this sort of through line. Despite the fact that there are many parts of it that I think are really subject to a lot of nuance and ambiguity, there was still a kind of way for a young boy like myself at the time to try to follow along the film and get it while not getting it at the same time. And then later on, when I grew up, of course, I watched more and more, and I think I kind of have most of the details under my belt, but I'm still very much in the dark when it comes to a lot of the background geopolitical stuff. But I will get to that later. But the point I wanted to bring up was that despite all that, there was still a sense of intrigue and suspense and espionage that I could follow as a little kid, and it was made elevated, ultra cool like by the music and by the cool gadgets. But when we sit back and think about it, this film is not overly reliant on the gadgets. True, there is a huge set piece around the middle involving the Aston Martin, and true, there is a whole thing. There's a scene with Q. There's the mentioning of the key ring, which I think is probably the important key gadget of the film, although it's not relied upon that much. a lot of the time we're seeing James Bond essentially using his wits to try to get out of situations and the like. And so this sort of ushers in also an important aspect, which is this feels like a fresh new Bond film, made fresh and new, or feeling like it's fresh and new by the very fact that we have a brand new Bond, which is Timothy Dalton. He seems to have a different approach to the James Bond role than Roger Moore did. Not to take anything away from Roger Moore. As I said earlier, I love Roger Moore films. I love his James Bond, and I always will. I always will. But that's not to say that that's not to say that I can only love one Bond actor and not another. It's possible in this world to love many Bond acting performances. And I think as different as Dalton's performances to Roger Moore's performance, I think both bring something so wonderful and fine to the role. And with that, I think Dalton's performance, what he brings to it, is like I don't want to say a breath of fresh air, because that might seem like it's insulting to the Roger Moore era, and I don't want to do that, because as I say, I really respect and love and admire the Roger Moore era. But Dalton's performance is something new and different in a lot of reasons, and so I'll try to get to that as well, which is why I think that was also something that I really attached to when I was a kid watching this film. And then growing up, I just grew to admire Dalton's Bond in this particular film just more and more and more, until now I watch this film and I really respect this performance. Very much so, and I'll try to get to the reasons why later. And then just other aspects of this film too. There are some really exciting action set pieces. What's that? What's the name of the plane? The Hercules, and the fight and that plane at the end between Necros and Bond, and the whole bags of opium, and the Kara inadvertently opens the back, and they're all dangling out there, and that wonderful, exciting set piece in the air, and they're in what's the phrase? In flight fight. I think that was the phrase used for the soundtrack, but. That's one example, and the Aston Martin sequence I mentioned earlier. Some of the fight sequences are very cool. The beginning, in terms of the defection of Koskov, as you will, and there's a really great sense of intrigue and espionage and spycraft, which is something that I always latched onto, even as a little kid. Those sorts of not just action set pieces, but also the moody, atmospheric spy film, the spy thriller. It's almost like Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming resurrected for purposes of this film. And that's also something that I do want to mention as well later, just a little bit. I mean, this is based off of a short story, kind of. At least the first maybe 10 or 15 minutes of this film is based off of a short story by Ian Fleming called The Living Daylights, and it's greatly expanded, as those of you who know the short story can attest to. It's greatly expanded by Michael G. Wilson and Richard Maybaum, but the kernel of the story is still there and still intact, and so this feels like a Fleming thriller, and in that sense, I think it there's a lot to latch onto and to really love and to admire even more, and it's these details that I think make this film stand out from the films that preceded it, and also it gives it a nice sense of freshness and attitude and excitement, and also it's one of my favorite Bond films, and so I'm very much looking forward to talking with you in a little bit of detail about this. But before I get into that, let me now just go to the live chat and just say hello, and hopefully we can go from there. So let's see. Just sorry about this. Let me just go back to the top here, and let's see here. Okay, so Kubrick Lover 1972 says, this is the first Bond film I saw in the theater. Oh, that's great. That's great. Dinobot Kiryu says, I hope you're doing good. I personally like this more than On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Not sure if it's in my top 10, but it's pretty good. I wish Dalton got to do more films. Yes, don't we all? Don't we all? It would have been great to see him do one more, at least one more. But what we got, License to Kill coming later, but I think in particular this film, this is a very, very strong film. This is one of my favorite Bond films, and so yeah, thank you very much, Zenova Kiryu. Thank you. Well said. Tomahawk238 is here. Hello. Atlanta, Georgia. So I hope you're well in Atlanta, my friend. Alan says, very, very happy about this live. Big fan of this film. Yes, yes. I know. Yes, I look forward to hearing your thoughts about this, my dear friend. Dennis A, hello. Didn't get a chance to finish watching this Bond film, but I still plan on watching the live stream. Thank you very much, my friend. Again, you don't. I'm going to be talking about specific plot aspects. So, if you want to watch the film first, that's perfectly fine. But anyway, it's nice to see you, my friend. I hope you're well. Zyrother says the Dalton films need a reevaluation. Yes, yes, they do. And let me just start with that. Zyrother and many people so far are praising this film and praising Dalton, I think. Yes, Timothy Dalton as James Bond it's one of the highlights, it's one of the strengths of this film. It's one of the appeal points, one of the marketing points, if you will, of this film, is the new James Bond. Okay, we had a great run with Roger Moore, of course, and as I say, I adore all of the Roger Moore films. I grew up also watching Moonraker on TV, so I love Moonraker. A View to a Kill was one of the first James Bond films I ever saw, so I love A View to a Kill. I know those are considered perhaps lesser Bond films, but I think those are great. And For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, and Spy Who Loved Me, of course, and Live and Let Die, and Man with a Golden Gun. Just fantastic stuff. And so I have nothing but greatest respect, and I have so much fun whenever I watch a Roger Moore film. But as I say, it is possible to hold two seemingly contradictory ideas at once in one's head. And if we take that to mean, as an example, loving one particular Bond actor or loving another particular Bond actor, I think it is possible to say that I love Roger Moore's performance and I love Timothy Dalton's performance at the same time. This performance by Dalton in this film is remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable for a number of reasons. He is already seemingly well established in the role. He is, as some of you probably know from some of the supplements that are made available on the older DVD or the newer Blu-ray set, what do you call it? Timothy Dalton was a trained actor. He is a trained actor, and so he has an acting theater background, and he brings a really strong, intense demeanor and attitude to this film. And so we don't have to worry about him not necessarily being shaky in terms of his acting chops. And so if that might have been, we've spoken a little bit about George Lazenby. And as I mentioned a few weeks ago, I'm a huge fan of George Lazenby's James Bond and On Her Majesty's Service, of course. But, one of the things that even George Lazenby acknowledges in the supplements is that he wasn't a trained actor. But Timothy Dalton is, and it really shows because from the get-go, he is established and he knows how to sort of show himself on screen. It seems like he's not at all intimidated by the camera. Instead, he's very much exuding confidence and intensity, which I think is really appropriate for this kind of Bond that he is trying to portray. They're trying to portray the dark, brooding loner of a Bond that is echoing a lot of the characteristics that were there in the Ian Fleming books, and they're there. And so, I like that kind of echoing, I like that kind of emphasis on his brooding, almost loner type of way about him. He's not. He does crack jokes, which probably is something similar to what we saw with Connery and with Lazenby for sure, and then definitely with Roger Moore. But I think a lot of people, myself included, sometimes find not everything, but maybe the occasional joke here and there in this film, as delivered by Dalton, might be a little bit might be a little bit not the most engaging delivery, let me put it that way. But that's not true for all of the jokes or quips in this film. In fact, I would suggest that when the humor works for Dalton, it really works. But I should be very clear. The humor that Timothy Dalton excels at in this film, in my opinion, isn't necessarily what I would call the written jokes. You know, there's one joke that I always thought was a little bit forced, which was some of the stuff that he says in the Aston Martin at the beginning, when that car chase starts up, after they after, you know, what the first police car rides next to them, and then the lasers shoot out of the Aston Martin and cuts the police car in half, slicing the wheels off from the body of the car. And then what does he say? Carr asks him what happened, and he turns to her and says, you know, salt corrosion. I always thought that it wasn't that bad, but the one that I thought was a little bit was the one where they're shooting at him, the car, and the bullets hit the windscreen, but they of course deflect because they're bulletproof. And so he says, you know, as the music is blaring and the car chase is going forward, he says, you know, amazing. He just turns, he says, amazing, this modern safety glass. And I always thought that was a little bit forced. That felt like something that I think Roger Moore could have delivered with a little bit more smoothness. But that's just an example of where I think it was a little bit shaky. But that's just one small example. I think there are other places, and many more places, where Dalton's humor, or maybe not necessarily humor as much as like double meaning or double-edged meaning to his words and his lines. And the way he delivers his lines, I think, are sometimes in the very flat, almost deadpan manner. It's really very funny. I mean, one of the funniest lines is after they're captured and they're put into the jails, or that they're about to be put into the jail cells in the Russian airbase, right? And you know, with the guard, and the very corpulent guard who has a whose English accent is really quite wonderful. There's a huge fight that ensues, and Kamran Shah is in one of the jail cells. We don't know his significance yet, and there's a huge fight, and then they subdue the guards, and Kara goes up to James and says, you know, it's fantastic, we're free. And then James Bond retorts, he said, you know, Kara, we're inside a Russian airbase in the middle of Afghanistan. And so I always thought that was one of the funniest lines, but it's not meant to be delivered in a way that is meant to be a, you know, a ha over the top joke, but it's sort of it's said just under the radar enough, but still it makes itself relevant. And I find that kind of humor by Dalton to be really well done, and that's an example where I think he's really very funny. And we see a lot of this too in other places. I always love the line. I know it's supposed to be really cold and deadly when he's in the hotel in Tangier, and he's Pushkin, and Pushkin's, I guess it's girlfriend, right? And Bond is there, and he's about to. Looks like he's about to assassinate Pushkin, but I think we as audience members knows that he's probably has something else on his mind. But in any event, you know, he's got him on the bed there, and he says, "You should have brought lilies." And I always loved that. I thought that was such a funny line, even in this cold, deadly serious line, the serious moment of the film. And these are examples of where I think Dalton's humor actually works very well. It is a Dalton type of humor. It's not a scripted, maybe James Bond, Roger Moore type of humor, like, oh, the modern safety glass line. But other places, I think, where he is allowed to shine in his natural Dalton mode, I think he shines exquisitely, and that makes him much more of a sympathetic character in my eyes. And so there are other moments like this where his line delivery, I think, is really, you know, here's another example of a joke that I think is delivered in a really great, it's not meant to be a ha-ha funny way, but it's delivered in a very double-edged meaning way. And I think it's really, I think it was meant to be a Roger Moore joke, but it's delivered and set up in a way that it ultimately becomes a really wonderful Dalton moment, and it's this at the very end when Necros is cut loose and he's flying to his death, and the doors they're in the Hercules airplane, and then the back door shuts, and then Bond diffuses the bomb, and he goes to the cockpit. And Kara says, what happened? And there's the line, right? He says, he got the boot, right? Which is, of course, meant to be a pun, a joke, based off the fact that he cut off the shoelaces of his boot just moments before, which therefore enabled him to basically kick or Necros flies to his death. And then he says, he got the boot. But remember how it's delivered, right? It's not, oh, he got the boot, ha, 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 ha. It's, he got the... And we see a shot of the plane headed towards a mountain cliff about to crash. So it says he got the boot, and he just runs. It's almost, and if you notice carefully, you don't even see his lips move in that moment. You just see him rush. It's almost, so it was looped over. That dialogue was probably looped over. So the shot that was used for that moment when he rushes towards the steering wheel, trying to evade the mountain cliff or whatever it was, that was probably the shot where he didn't say the line, he got the boot. So that was looped over. But I love that moment because it does a number of things. It allows him to say what could have been a kind of Roger Moore type of a throwaway James Bond humor, which I think in Roger Moore's hands would have been really funny and brilliant. But as I say, in Timothy Dalton's hands, it might have been kind of shaky. But it's done in a way, and probably you have to credit also John Glenn for this, and other people, the editing and behind the scenes of creating a moment where it could have gone another kind of less than engaging sort of way in terms of a throwaway humor line, but it's done in a way that is still a Dalton moment, because it's like he got the, and he just says the line, but he knows that there's something more important, that is to get the heck out of there before they crash into the mountain. And so that is in essence I think a really pivotal moment for me, because it's almost like that feels to me like it's the passing of the torch moment, where Bond, we've already seen up to that point where Timothy Dalton really holds his own as James Bond. So even at the very outset we see him hold his own. He becomes Bond, I think, at the very outset. But I always think symbolically in my mind, if I'm thinking about the lines, and I think what lines in the script probably were penned with Roger Moore still in mind, or what lines were written with Roger Moore not in mind. And I think that's probably one of those lines that could have been said by Roger Moore in a Roger Moore James Bond film, but it's delivered and set up in a way that becomes a pure Dalton moment. He almost doesn't care about that because he has more important things to do. And so I love that moment. And so I think symbolically, I think that's one of the moments in my eyes where I think that's the passing of the torch. That's where Timothy Dalton really becomes his own Bond. And we go from there. So I find that stuff to be really quite exciting. Incidentally, of course, that whole sequence right after he cuts the boot off, and that whole sequence from when he runs to the cockpit and he takes the controls and tries to steer the plane away, and then he sets up the bomb to blow up the bridge, and then after that they're running out of fuel, so they've got to go get into the back in the Jeep, and then the plane crashes, and the Jeep does that thing with the parachute, and then it crash lands, and the Jeep miraculously lands, and they drive off. They drive off to Karachi, and they'll just make it in time for dinner. James Bond apparently does all of this stuff, remarkably so, with only one boot, right? Because he cut off one of his boots, so one of his feet is just with a sock. So it doesn't have a boot on. So I always like to think, wow, James Bond, Timothy Dalton's James Bond, he can do all this stuff, and he can do it without wearing both boots. And I thought that was so cool. Of course, I know it's a film, and I know probably as far as the acting and the performance, the Timothy Dalton there's probably during some of that stuff when we couldn't see, he was probably wearing two shoes. But I just love to keep that illusion in my mind. But while I'm on the topic of Dalton, before I go to the live chat here, I should also mention that his line delivery that isn't necessarily meant to be jokes. There are some line deliveries which I think are absolutely superb, and they really belong in the James Bond fan books as being some of the best line deliveries. I think, for example, it's probably, it was probably meant to be a joke, but remember the Aston Martin scene when when there's the roadblock and the Aston Martin is going forward, and then he turns on the missile, and then the missile targets are on screen, and they're about to converge, and the John Barry music starts to kick in with that wonderful sort of synthesizer, da 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 da, and then Carr said, "What is this?" And I love the delivery. He just very coolly, almost like he doesn't care. He just says, "And if a few optional extras installed," right? And I thought that that's such a cool line delivery. He doesn't force it. It's just, I know exactly what I'm doing, and that's great. Another similar line delivery is after Saunders is killed, assassinated in Vienna, and he chases the balloons, which end up being this mother and a boy, frighten them to death, I'm sure. And he says, Kara catches up with him and says, "What happened?" He said, "Bad accident back there." And then she doesn't have the good mind to sort of pursue that, but she just says, "Did you hear?" She's just preoccupied with Georgy Koskov, and so she says, "Did you hear?" And then he just looks at her almost shocked, and he says, "You hear from Georgy?" And he turns, and that wonderful moment when he turns, and it's a shot of him up close with Carr in the background, and it's sort of deep focus, I think the phrase is, and his face is so up close in the frame. It says, "Yes, I got the message." That kind of line delivery, I thought was so cool, so suave, and so seething with anger and frustration, and just a real coolness, which I thought was just so wonderful. Even his kind of line delivery, just with simple things. I think he's got maybe a Welsh accent. Perhaps I don't quite notice it that much because my ear is not so trained to pick up that sort of thing. But I love the way he says that, just things like the way he pronounces the names, like when he discovers that Whitaker and Koskov are in cahoots. He says, I love the way he says those names when he's talking to Saunders in the Prater Cafe. He says, Koskov and Whitaker. I just love how he says Koskov, and I love how he says Whitaker. I can't do a good Timothy Dalton impersonation. If you want a good impersonation, you should check out, you probably know, what Oliver Harper's channel, and he and his friend Duncan Casey did a Living Daylights commentary a few years back, and Duncan Casey's impression of Timothy Dalton is second to none. It's just absolutely brilliant. They really go to town with one of the phrases that Timothy Dalton uses in that's used later in the behind the scenes documentary, and he says, talking about James Bond and how he's not he's not the Superman, and you can't identify with a Superman. So I love those sorts of moments of Dalton being so cool and suave. There's another moment that he gives early on when they're in Bratislava, and he's in the room opposite the concert hall with Saunders, and he's about to get ready because they can anticipate the possibility of a sniper being on Koskov as Koskov is trying to make his getaway through his sort of defection. And they're on the roof, or not the roof, that they're on the balcony there, and then Bond surveys the scene, and he says, gives us just probably about 10 seconds, just enough time for a sniper to make strawberry jam of him. And I love how he says strawberry jam at the moment when he pulls, or he pulls a lever on the gun or something like that, and just says just enough time for a sniper to make strawberry jam of him. And just the emphasis on jam in that particular moment, it really echoes, or it really signals the fact that we have a new, mean, almost angry Bond, and he's sort of no nonsense. I mean, we got a sense of that from the pre-credit sequence, right? Because he was all action. And he didn't care about the pretense. He was running through when he was trying to pursue the assassin. He didn't care about the war games exercise, and when one of the guards was there, he just ran right through him. It reminded me also of the moment, in the later film Casino Royale with Daniel Craig. In one of the early sequences there's a scene where he's actually running through a wall. I think it's meant to show his brute force philosophy towards his job. Well, I think this similar kind of brute force philosophy is shown in this credit sequence by Timothy Dalton as he runs through the guard as he's trying to pursue the assassin as he's getting away. And I always love that moment. It's in many ways an echo of what we'll see in Daniel Craig's performance. Not everything, but I think a good chunk of it is something that we will see in Daniel Craig's performance later on. So. But the point is that after he takes care of the assassin and the assassin has been killed in the explosion, James Bond is in his parachute. He lands on the boat, the woman talking to Margot. He's so sick of all the men and all the playboys and tennis pros. If only she could find a real man. And then he tumbles from the roof, and no nonsense. He'll report in an hour, but there is a little bit of time for play, of course, because he says better make that 2. And so he is still the James Bond that knows how to I guess have fun, I suppose. But the Timothy Dalton Bond that we see here isn't a ladies' man per se. We do see him at this pre-credit sequence, of course, but throughout the film, his romantic interest or his relationship is with Kara. And so a lot was made of this as well. I remember James Bond being, what was the phrase, a one-woman Bond, because up to now we've always seen James Bond with a number of romantic interests in a single film, not just one. But here we get the relationship that he has with the character Cara Malovi, played by Mariam Diallo. And so that's another example, I think, of where Dalton's performance is really good and sublime. I think not only is he kind of a no-nonsense Bond, you see him, the way he acts and also the way he speaks, but also he is a Bond that is, I think, he is different, right? And one of the ways that he's different is that his relationship with Kara is one of the only, it's the only love interest relationship that he has, which differs from what we see before. And so this is all to say that I think we see a lot of interesting, new, fresh approaches to the concept of Bond by the powers that be, but also in Timothy Dalton's hands as well. And we also see aspects of Bond, Timothy Dalton's Bond. Sometimes we see him, on the top of that car there, that truck there, as he's driving. It's not wholly him. Of course, there are still stunt people playing certain aspects of the scenes that involve action. But for some of the shots, we do see Timothy Dalton on the top there, or we see him really going to work with the machine gun in the Russian airbase, for example, or other scenes of that nature. And so it's good to see James Bond in a kind of action element, or Timothy Dalton's James Bond in an action element, which of course is slightly different from what we saw with the Roger Moore films. Roger Moore's Bond was very often seen with a lot of background, back screen projection and that sort of thing. Here we do get a little bit of that, don't get me wrong, and there's some stunt work there as well, but I think there's more of an effort to try to create the illusion anywhere, or try to show that this Timothy Dalton's Bond is trying to be a little bit more hands-on to the extent possible in terms of his ability to participate in the action set pieces. And so I really admire that about his approach. It feels fresh. It feels like it feels like it has a different life to it, and so and the line delivery is great. And even where sometimes the humor might be a little bit flat, there are other moments that I think overpower those moments, and Timothy Dalton delivers lines in a very Timothy Dalton way, and when he's allowed to do that, they work brilliantly. And so I think overall his performance in this film is just fantastic. And also there are just little details as well about his Bond and the way that his Bond operates in this universe. So 2 things I'll say, and then I'll go back to the live chat. The first is that there isn't much focus on Timothy Dalton's Bond as being a kind of snob, in the sense that maybe in the past James Bond, Sean Connery's James Bond, or George Lazenby's James Bond, Beluga, north of the Caspian, or that sort of thing, or especially Roger, and also Roger Moore's James Bond would show their fine tastes in gourmand, and fine tastes in food and alcohol and cuisine and that sort of thing. Here we get a little bit of that, but not that much, not as much as the indifferently blended brandy, for instance, of Sean Connery's day, with an overdose of Bombois or something like that. We don't get anything like that in Timothy Dalton's approach to James Bond in The Living Daylights, although there are moments where he seems to be a little bit showing his appreciation for fine wine and fine dining. So, for example, when he buys the Bollinger, even though because what does he say? The what was listed was a little bit questionable, so he took the initiative and bought something that he thought was a little bit more appropriate. So he bought Bollinger for the meeting with Koskov at Bladen Safe House. And then later on, it's a little detail, I never noticed it until much later, but remember when Saunders and Bond are in the Ferry Cafe, or the Prodder Park Cafe, and this is where Saunders is going to give him the information about who bought the Lady Rose and how it was sold at auction in New York to Brad Whitaker. And so during the scene, at the very outset, do you notice they're drinking coffee, and Bond takes a sip of his coffee as Saunders is beginning his explanation. And you notice Timothy Dalton, he's on the left-hand side of the screen. He takes a sip and he kind of looks at the coffee. He's like, he just puts it down, almost like he is in disagreement with the flavor of the coffee. Maybe it's something that it doesn't taste so good. And I always like to think that this is the kind of the Bond who appreciates fine wines and fine coffees, and he's found something that is a little bit disagreeable to his palate. And so that's probably one of the ways that he is showing his sort of gourmand taste, as it will. And so but he doesn't go overboard with it, and I really appreciate his restraint in doing so. So I like that aspect of it. The other aspect of Timothy Dalton's James Bond that I really, really enjoy is we get a lot of this later in the next film, License to Kill, in terms of James Bond as a rogue agent. Rogue meaning he defies his direct orders from his superior, M, to go rogue and to go out on his own mission of revenge, and that's License to Kill. Here in Living Daylights, he is under orders, and he does follow the orders, of course, but there are a lot of key moments where Timothy Dalton's James Bond defies orders. He says he goes on instinct, and it's his instinct that he ends up being right in the end, of course, but he follows his instinct, which is essentially goes against what he was originally instructed to do in the first place. So here are a few examples. He was ordered to kill the assassin if an assassin was to emerge at the time that Koskov was attempting to defect in Bratislava. And so Bond sees who we understand later to be Cara Milovi, and the window there, the concert hall. And he says, he was ordered to kill her, but he didn't, of course. He just merely shot the rifle out of her hand, causing an injury to her arm. But so there's that incident where he defied orders. Another incident where he defied orders was where he was ordered to kill Pushkin. M gave him the direct order to kill Pushkin, to assassinate Pushkin. But what does he do? He doesn't kill Pushkin. He sets up the assassination, the fake assassination of Pushkin, in order to figure out exactly what Koskov's plan is. And so that is another instance where he defies orders based off of his own instinct. And even a very minor, but still I think significant and consistent one is one that I just mentioned earlier, was when he goes to the Bladen Safe House, and he was ordered to buy whatever wine or champagne that he was meant to buy, but instead he took the liberty of choosing something different because what was listed was, in his eyes, a little bit questionable. So he ended up going with the Bollinger, right? So there's another instance where he just goes off and defies orders. Of course, we've seen James Bond in the past go rogue a little bit, but for the most part, Roger Moore's James Bond has been one who essentially followed orders, and it's never been a sense of a direct defiance of any order. I would say that Sean Connery's James Bond more or less was of a similar vein. Perhaps something that we saw in a past Bond that might be similar to this going rogue, even in these elements that we see in Timothy Dalton in The Living Daylights, probably something like George Lazenby's James Bond in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Remember when M decries or declares Operation Bedlam is dead in that film, but then so therefore the resources of Her Majesty's government won't be relied upon for a final confrontation with Blofeld. And so what does Bond do? He essentially defies that and tries to go the route of Draco, and so that's a kind of defiance. But we understand maybe that it was M's intention all along, maybe to have him go that route, because maybe M was sort of implicitly encouraging Bond to do that. But that's a whole different conversation entirely. But my point is that while we do see echoes in the past from other Bond performances of Bond being someone who defies orders where it suits him, here we get actually quite a lot of it. And it maybe is a kind of precursor for what is to come in the next film, where we get a whole dose of it. And it's so emphasized to the fact that he becomes a really rogue agent. But I like the fact that, in an interesting way, the seeds are being sown with his performance in The Living Daylights here. And so these are all elements that I think make his Bond stand out from the crowd, or from what we've seen in the past, more or less. And so already, off the bat, he has already established himself as Bond. He has already laid the groundwork. He has already stuck his flag in the ground and has made a great declaration, I am James Bond, in a very fabulous way. And so I think that Dalton's performance is what would Koskov say, right? Superb, Mr. Bond, superb. And so absolutely wonderful. But yeah, so that's my take on Dalton. But I think that a number of people agree with me in terms of it would have been nice to see Dalton continue with at least one more film, maybe a couple more beyond beyond License to Kill. But oh well, and at least we have this and the other film. So and I do think that even this film alone is still a remarkable achievement. Let's see. Okay, just going through the chat here. Kubrick Lover 1972 says John Barry's score is kind of jazzier with lots of drums and techno-like music. Yes, it is. It has a nice synthesizer element to it, which I think is really great. Oh, Razor Wire Reviews, Luke is here. I don't have time to fully join, but I approve of Welsh Bond. License to Kill is far and away my favorite of the two Dalton did, though. Great, great. Let's see. Erwin says, they aired Roger Moore era films at the time on Dutch TV when I was young and loved them all as well. Yes. Let's see. Wolfgrat says, yes, looking forward to watching the next one. Cooper Glover, 1972, says, some of the stunts in this film are edge of your seat. Yes, I agree. Zyrother says, the cargo plane stunt is insane. Yes, I agree. And I'll try to talk a little bit more about that. Wolfgrat says, I did like nearly all the stunts, Brian. I have my doubts about the cello. Yes, the cello. Let me talk about the cello and talk about Cara Malovi. As I said, I saw this film when I was 8 or 9, and so it was an impressionable age. But whether one is 8 or 9, or whether one is 14, 15, or whether one is 20 or 21 or older, I think it's very easy to be very smitten with Cara Malovi, Maram Dabo's Cara Malovi, and I think she's one of my her performances and her character is one of my favorite characters in the James Bond universe. because she is, I think, very understandably inexperienced in this world of espionage, and she is a cellist, and she obviously loves her, I guess you could call it vocation, but her calling in life. And she just gets mixed up with this man, Koskov, and it just starts this, whatever their past romantic relationship was, it essentially leads her through these events that we see in the film, ultimately in the arms of this man from the British Secret Service. And so, but I think that I really like her character in that it's seemingly, I don't want to say naive, because it's not really naive, although there are some aspects of her character that are understandably, how should I put it, not necessarily experienced with the whole complications of the world of spycraft and espionage. See how she is very easily convinced by Koskov when she calls Whitaker at his house in Tangier, and that leads to the sort of the third act of the film, where Bond is drugged. What does he say? Chloral hydrate. And that's where she basically betrays him, only to save him on the plane, or save him later by getting his keyring afterwards. And therefore their allegiance is kind of confirmed, as it were. So, so she does seem to be a little bit swayed and confused, but I think it's very natural, because in this world with the double cross and double crosses that goes on, people are lying, people are pretending to be other people that they're not. Bond himself is lying to Karmalovi. Koskov is, of course, lying. Koskov is pretending to be I mean, he is a Russian general, but he's really a rogue Russian general. He's got his own agenda, and that sort of thing. Kamran Shah, he pretends to be this guy in the prison, but in fact he is the deputy commander of the Eastern District at the Mujahideen, which I'll talk about as well. So it's very understandable that Kara would be confused. I'm confused as a viewer when I'm watching this film, because, as I say, there's a lot of double cross. There's a moment when Kara and Bond are in Vienna and they're watching the Marriage of Figaro, the Mozart opera, The Marriage of Figaro, and there's a particular moment where there's a lot of confusion and like identity confusion, and all this stuff is going on. I feel like that's very apropos in terms of this film, because there's a lot of identity confusion and a lot of things going on at once that make it very confusing for me as a viewer. And so I can understand it if Kara herself might be confused as to where her allegiances should lie and where they shouldn't. And so I can forgive her for what she did to Bond, especially afterwards when she essentially helps to save him by helping to convince Kamran Shah and his forces to go to Bond's rescue when he's trapped in the truck that is filled with the opium on its way to the Russian airbase. So, I like her too, because she also has a certain kind of, I don't want to say spunk necessarily, but she really loves her cello, right? And she insists that Bond go to the conservatoire and pick up the cello, right? Because it's the Lady Rose. And so it's a very significant, important cello for her. And so, right, there's that great moment when they're in the car, and he says, we'll have 10 minutes if we're lucky before they find out what's happened. And she says, we've got to go to pick up my cello. And she says, and Bond says, no way. And then it cuts to him waiting outside of the conservatoire, just waiting and being impatient. So I love that moment. So it's the ellipsis, right? One of the great things that we see in cinema. There's no way I'm going to go there, and then cut to that very place. We see that in a lot of films, a lot of Hollywood films, and here's another example of that. And so that shows a kind of the power of persuasion that Karmalovi seems to have, but it's not necessarily a manipulative Machiavellian one. I would say it's more on the line of she really is earnestly, innocently just wanting to get her cello, and glad I'm right. And he says later, right, glad I insisted that you brought that cello, right, because then we have the whole cello chase down the slope there, and I think this is probably Yeah, this is probably one of those you either go with it or you don't moments. And if you don't go with it, I mean, it lasts for what? It doesn't last for very long. It lasts maybe a minute, maybe more out of a film that's over 2 hours. So it goes by very quickly. And even if one doesn't go with that particular moment, it does cap off a very, I mean, seemingly outlandish car chase involving an Aston Martin that basically does everything. It just throws everything out the window and the kitchen sink and self-destructs and all this stuff. And so, I mean, if I can buy that, then I can still go with the idea of Bond and car sliding down the slopes there with on the cello case. So. But even if one doesn't go with it, I can understand that as well. The one thing I never really got, though, is why didn't the immigration officials insist that they stop the people riding the cello? If I were working at immigration, I would think, no, you got to stop. You got to stop riding that cello case, stand up, show me your passports, and then you can go. I'm not going to let you pass. So I would have stopped them. And they didn't even try to chase them after they passed the border and all that stuff, right? We've nothing to declare, just the cello, cello, cello. And so, but again, that's just a minor point, I suppose. But if I were the immigration official, I would have stopped them, right? Oh well, c'est la vie. I guess thank goodness for Bond that I wasn't there. Otherwise, the film probably would have ended. But because I would have asked them to stop. But glad they didn't stop, because then that meant the film could progress. So there's oftentimes there are a little bit of there are sometimes those moments where I wouldn't call them plot holes, but there are sometimes those moments where you think, what's going on here? It doesn't really quite work. Another instance like that is when they're in the prison or the jail in the Russian air base in Afghanistan. When they go in, it's daytime. And then they have their fight inside, and they free Cameron Shaw, and they go out, they get their coats and go out. And I could swear it's not maybe 10 minutes couldn't have passed since they were outside in the daytime. And then they go into the jail cell, and it's now nighttime. So I always, were they transferred before or something? Was there some time in between where they were waiting in some kind of lobby or something? But I don't know. But in any event, that's a really quick passage of time from going from daytime to nighttime. So I always found that to be a little bit awkward. Another one was they escape. And by this time, Bond is already identified by Koskov as being the assassin of General Pushkin. And so this is and he's a British secret agent, and so this is a big deal. So he is kind of a hot property when it comes to a prisoner. And so if I were heading that airbase, I would be very sure. I would be darn sure to be sure that he was locked up. And I'd always double the guard, and I'd just check in with the jail, maybe periodically, maybe every hour or so. But we get none of that, right? Because apparently they escape, and then they take that little car thing, and they go over the fence, and then they spend the night with Cameron Shaw and his men, and then they go back the next day. So all this time, and then when Koskov finally sees Bond on the plane, Koskov is so surprised to see Bond, and then that whole fight scene ensues at the very end, the climax ensues. And I think no one ever bothered to check that Bond and Kara had escaped from the jail cell, and the guy who was running it was like writhing in pain. He probably broke his arm or something, but no one bothered to check, right? I guess the jail cells were soundproof. That's what the guy said, right? Because the colonel doesn't like to hear screaming from the jail. But I guess my point is that they should have checked, right? But anyway, that, again, a very minor point. Again, it probably, had they checked, that would have been the end of the film, because then Russian forces would have been out trying to find Bond and trying to apprehend him, and thus that would have been the end of the film. It certainly would have led to a different ending than the one we got, which I think is really fun and exciting. But what was I saying? So going back, I think, just doubling back to my original point here about Kara Malovia as a character, I like her very much because she is innocent, and she is understandably confused sometimes about the situation. But as I said earlier, I think that's understandable, because this is a very confusing world that's being painted, and James Bond is occupying. Also, she has a really sweet nature. and it comes through in her devotion to Koskov first, and then her devotion to Bond later. I love the scene in particular when she and Bond are they're in the room with Cameron Shaw, or in his men, and they're in a room by themselves, and she's changed. And what does he say to her? He says, Haista, and oh, it means beautiful in Afghan. That's his line. And then he says, you're going back to the Khyber Pass. I'm going back to the base and go after Georgi. And they have that argument. And she says, I'm not coming. I want to come with you. And he says, no. If you make trouble, I'm going to send you back to London. And then she has a little bit of a tantrum, and he throws the pillows at him, and then says something, and then she says, this is back end of horse, right? I love that scene. I think that's such a tender scene. And right, what happens after that, right? That scene ends with, okay, you're going back to the Khyber Pass, or you're going back, and I'm going to go alone and handle Georgi Koskov on my own. But then what happens? Cut to the next scene. We assume it's the next day, early morning, dawn. Who's there? Bond and Kara. So there we go again. Her powers of persuasion. She convinced him to go back to the conservatoire to get the Lady Rose, and she convinced him again to let her tag along and be with him as they're making their final assault on the, or not final assault, as they're trying to go back to the Russian airbase to figure out exactly what's going on. So again, kudos to Kara for showing initiative and for having great powers of persuasion over Bond. I think that's really wonderful. Although it's one of those things where maybe he is too trusting, and he is right, so trusting of her to the point where he drinks the vodka martini that she prepares, not realizing that she is going to betray him because it's laced with chloral hydrate, and so. If Bond were more on his toes, perhaps he would have maybe tried to take care of himself. But I think that by that point he was genuinely having feelings for Kara, and who wouldn't by this time? Because I think they have a really wonderful chemistry and rapport. And as I say, she as a character, I think, is very warm, and wonderful performance by Mariam Dabo. So, but the cello, I'm on the side of the debate where I'm okay with the cello. I think it's a very important aspect. And again, without the cello, they probably wouldn't have been able to escape from the forces in Czechoslovakia. And so but anyway, the cello stunt. So going back to that's the Kubrick, the cello stunt. Yes, Wolfgratz and Zyrother. And Kubrick. Zyrother says that cello case sled is actually held at the National Motor Museum. Wow, that's interesting. I'd love to check that out one day. Pete, 1972, says, hello to Daisuke and everyone. Yes, Zyrother says it was a fake case jigger to actually be a sled, but they did go down a hill. Yes, I think that's what John Glenn describes in the documentary about how it wasn't really, it was a case shape, but it was a sled, yes. Yes, Mariam Dabo comments that she was in pure terror the whole time. Yes, that's also in the comment, in the supplemental materials, yes. Let's see. Okay, just. Pete 1972 says, one of my favorite Bond movies of all time. Dalton manages to truly capture the grittiness of the book Bond, the Fleming Bond, while still retaining the charm and sometimes the humor of the movie Bond. Yes, I love I was mentioning too about how he gives his dialogue. I mean, one of the famous lines of dialogue is at the end of the first sequence, as they're driving after Koskov has defected, and Bond is driving with Saunders, and Saunders is complaining about how he, basically went against orders, and Bond says, "Stuff my orders. If anyone wants to fire me, I'll be grateful for it." And then he says the famous line, "Whoever she was must have scared the living daylights out of her." And it cuts to London. So I love that delivery, and I mean that's taken from the Ian Fleming short story, "The Living Daylights." As you know, probably the Living Daylights story is essentially that first sequence. It's a little bit. The film extends a lot of aspects of it, but the soul of the Ian Fleming short story is there. In that initial sequence involving the sniper, and the sniper was a woman, and that sort of thing, and so and then it's expanded further. But Timothy Dalton's performance, I think, is very consistent with the Ian Fleming characterization of the character, and so I really appreciate that interpretation by Timothy Dalton very much. Excuse me. While I'm on the topic of the plot, let me now just very briefly talk about this film's plot. And I think it's actually very, very confusing. And I would suggest that its confusing nature is, in fact, paradoxically, one of its strengths, in my opinion. And I'll try to explain why. Okay, so the, let's see, what do you call it? The plot of the film, as I was trying to explain earlier, I think is very convoluted, and it's actually quite difficult to follow. But in essence, what's going on? What's the plot of the bad guys? What are the bad guys trying to do? Okay, so the bad guys are three. They are Whitaker and Koskov and Necros. And I know that there has been some criticism against the film. And in fact, when I was younger, I had the same criticism about the film, about how the villains were seemingly weak. They weren't necessarily the types of Bond villains, the outlandish, over-the-top Bond villains that we were used to in films past, with Goldfinger or Stromberg and The Spy Who Loved Me, or even the most recently, even someone like Christopher Walken's Max Zorin or something like that. So these were villains that maybe seemed a little bit blander in terms of their outlandishness. I mean, or Drax. I mean, this isn't Drax. This isn't Goldfinger that we're talking about. This is Whitaker and Koskov. And so there is a sense of comparing them with past Bond villains. And one way of looking at it is, yes, they might seem a little bit on the less exciting side, let me put it that way. And I did feel this way when I was younger. But, and I'll talk about Necros in a second, because I think Necros is actually very, very exciting and very bold as in terms of a Bond villain. But let's focus on Koskov and Whitaker. But I think the fact that they are kind of bland, well, I don't want to say bland necessarily, because Whitaker is actually very outlandish and over the top, but he gets very little screen time. Koskov is probably, in my eyes, probably the main villain in terms of his screen time and in terms of how much he is interacting with Bond directly. And he is also an antagonist in the sense that he is a rival for the romantic interests with respect to Cara Malovian. So we sometimes see this with Bond villains. Bond villains, not all Bond villains, but some Bond villains are also there's a kind of sexual jealousy element to the antagonism, not just the plot to destroy the world or something, and Bond is on the mission to try to stop it or thwart it. But there's also this element of maybe a romantic love triangle or something. I know it's not a traditional love triangle in that sense of the word, narratively speaking, but there is a thematic love triangle sometimes. And so if we think of it in those terms, yes, Koskov is probably the baddie, and he's working with Whitaker, who's also a kind of baddie. So it's almost like the bad guy is divided into two parts. The Koskov, who is probably the main baddie, and then the Whitaker side, which is the more outlandish, over the top. But Whitaker gets, relatively speaking, less screen time than Koskov. Okay. But even so, I think there is still a sense of their characters not necessarily, at least in some people's eyes, not necessarily being of the same level as, say, Goldfinger or Drax or Stromberg or something. But here's where I would here's where what I would say to that. On the other hand, if anyone thinks that way, I would. On the other hand, I agree. On one hand, I agree. But at the same time, we have to remember that this plot of The Living Daylights is actually quite a radically different type of plot than the types of plots that we were used to seeing in past Bond films. How so? In past Bond films, let's say maybe with the exception of a film like, say, From Russia with Love. Let's leave that aside. But for every other past Bond film, I would suggest that while there were references made to the current geopolitical climate of the time, namely the Cold War atmosphere, we saw references made, for example, to U.S.-Soviet tensions in, say, You Only Live Twice. Heck, we see that in almost all the Bond films during the Cold War era, because that was the nature of espionage films during that time, right? It was the Cold War. Of course, we're going to have references to the current geopolitical climate, but they weren't necessarily the main thrust of the film. For instance, Goldfinger's plot, the film Goldfinger's plot, is not a geopolitically minded plot. It's just a plot for a rich man to get richer. That's essentially what the plot of Goldfinger is. Or we have a Thunderball plot, which is essentially, it does have these implications of geopolitical ramifications around the world, but those aren't consistent with a Cold War threat as much as here is a plot to essentially destroy the world, in essence. The same is true for You Only Live Twice. A similar kind of thing is going on with on Her Majesty's Secret Service. There isn't necessarily this geopolitical threat, and on and on and on through the films, save for From Russia with Love, because there is a sense of a kind of geopolitical threat. But even with From Russia with Love, I would say that that pales in comparison to the types of geopolitical references that are made in this film, The Living Daylights. And what do I mean by this? This makes direct reference to the Soviet-Afghan War. This really does. It doesn't spell it out and draw it out completely, but it's a film that goes into this conflict, which was still going on during the 80s. I mean, it was all the way through the 1980s, of course, and in fact, around the time of this film, I'm not an expert in this particular aspect of history, but what I know is that around this time, there were efforts made by this Soviet government and Gorbachev, who was in power by then, to essentially de-escalate Soviet forces in Soviet occupying forces in Afghanistan. And so, but this was still a hot kind of conflict. And in many ways, too, for those of you who know your history about this area, this also served as a kind of proxy war in terms of the invested interests that were invested in whatever particular side or sides of this particular conflict during this time. And so, and Bond is right in the thick of things here. It's not a direct reference in terms of he is involved in espionage directly related to Soviet-Afghan war, but it's still going on, and he is in Afghanistan, and so there are references, I think, directly made there. And the Mujahideen is also referenced here too. So this is very interesting. Okay, this is what makes this film very, very confusing. Okay, which I think is great about this film. And it's, I think, the first time we get a plot that is really quite convoluted like this. Up to now, again, we've had a lot of plots where the bad guys trying to do something, take over the world, corner the market, destroy a part of the world or something like that. So it's pretty much I mean, there are some intricacies in plots, of course, but it's pretty much a pretty easy to follow plot, which isn't a bad thing. For films up to The Living Daylights. But here we have something different, right? We have a plot that is very hard to follow, that is made even further complicated by the geopolitical references that are being directly made by the film. So what do I mean by this? Okay, what is the plot of Koskov and Whitaker? Okay, Pushkin is somehow responsible for this deal being made between the Russian government and Whitaker for the Russian government to pay 50 million US dollars to Brad Whitaker so that Brad Whitaker could then provide the Russian government with some kind of samples of high-tech arms, we think, that are generated from, according to Whitaker, the US and Europe. So this is essentially an arms deal between the Russian government and Brad Whitaker. And the consideration for this transaction is $50 million from the Russian government to be paid to Brad Whitaker, and then in return, Brad Whitaker will provide these arms. So this is an arms deal, and Pushkin is the face of this. So this is the official Russian or Soviet a transaction that is meant to be had. And in the middle of this, we understand that Koskov has had dealings with Whitaker in the past. So Koskov is we understand, handling this $50 million transaction between the Russian government or the Soviet government, the Soviet side, and Brad Whitaker. Okay. But then what does Koskov do? He decides to use that 50 million, we assume, in cahoots with Brad Whitaker to go somehow to exchange that for diamonds in Amsterdam. So then they could use the diamonds in Amsterdam, which they have to ship to Afghanistan, hidden in ice, which is surrounding a heart, which is supposed to look like a human's heart, but it's in fact an animal's heart. But the point is, they smuggle diamonds to a Russian airbase in Afghanistan. For what? So that they can clandestinely, behind the scenes, without the Russian government's knowledge, and that's why they needed Pushkin out of the way. So the plot was for Brad Whitaker and Koskov, through Koskov's connections in as a Russian general, for him to unofficially misuse funds by using the money to get diamonds, so then the diamonds could be used for the purchase of opium, which is to be purchased from the Snow Leopard Brotherhood in Afghanistan. And it's unclear exactly what the Snow Leopard Brotherhood's connections are with Kamran Shah and the Mujahideen, because we understand that Kamran Shah is not directly working for the Snow Leopards Brotherhood, but that he has worked with them in the past on some missions or something like that. So there is some kind of allegiance or alliance or something between the Snow Leopards Brotherhood and the Mujahideen forces as represented by Kamran Shah. But the point is that the Mujahideen, as shown by Kamran Shah, seem to be condoning this transaction between the Snow Leopard Brotherhood and Koskov. Namely, Koskov will give them whatever diamonds in exchange for opium. Okay, so this is already very interesting. And then we should take a step back. Now, why did Koskov and Whitaker do this plan with Spionim at the very beginning, which opens up the first part of the film? Apparently, that was all meant to be a ruse in order to get the British government to assassinate Pushkin, so that Pushkin would be out of the way. Once Pushkin is out of the way, then there is no threat against Koskov, because Pushkin was already getting suspicious. Pushkin was about to arrest Koskov for what he calls misusing state funds. And once Pushkin, therefore, is out of the way, then Koskov and Whitaker can proceed with their transaction by exchanging diamonds for opium with their deal with the Snow Leopard Brotherhood in Afghanistan. Okay, and so in order to do that, they set up this elaborate plot of creating the illusion of the existence of the Spirit Spionim program, and they did this all the way back to the Rock of Gibraltar war exercise, the assassination of 004, and the assassination of Saunders, and all this, just so they could convince James Bond or the British Secret Service to assassinate Pushkin. Right, that's really quite incredible. I mean, why couldn't they... Why was it impossible for Koskov to conceive of a plan using Russian resources or Soviet resources to assassinate Pushkin? Why did he have to concoct a plan to pretend to defect to the West, meet with the British government, then pretend to get apprehended by the KGB at the Blade and Safe House, where in fact it wasn't the KGB, it was Necros, and then pretend to have been apprehended by by Moscow and then assumingly assassinated, but instead he's hiding out in Tangier, assumingly awaiting for Pushkin's assassination so that Koskov can then carry through with the opium deal with the Snow Leopards Brotherhood in Afghanistan. So all this plot is actually already quite elaborate and actually very, very complicated. And so I mean, the more I think about it, the more I realize it's quite a narrative, what's the word, morass. But I think that's what makes it quite fascinating, because it really touches on these sorts of real-world implications that we haven't seen in a James Bond film up to now. But I haven't finished yet with this. So okay, so now Pushkin has been put out of the way. And we know as viewers that, as Felix Leiter says, so this was a put-up job. So it was a put-up job. It was a ruse, an act. Pushkin isn't dead. But in fact, this was something that was planned between, we assume, Bond and Pushkin in order to create the illusion that he was dead, so that they could figure out what Koskov is indeed up to. Because at this point in time, they're not sure exactly what he's up to. Okay, so then this takes them to Afghanistan. And this takes them to the deal between the opium deal, and so Bond puts two and two together and understands that the amount of opium that's being transacted will probably be worth around $500 million in the U.S. Market. Excuse me. And so the idea is that then Koskov and Whitaker will then sell the opium to the U.S. markets, wherever you sell the opium. So there will be drug dealers, and in return for their drug dealers dealings abroad, they will get however, tenfold or 100-fold of the initial down payment by the Russian government. And so therefore they can pay back the down payment to the Russian government. They can keep the remaining proceeds of the opium deal trades in the United States, and none will be the wiser, because the Russian government wouldn't find out about it, and Koskov and Whitaker, and probably Necros too, would walk away very, very rich men. So that's the plot. Right? That's the plot. Now, what makes it even more complicated is the fact that we are touching upon the current events at the time, anyway, of the Soviet-Afghan conflict. And we have to remember, therefore, that it's a very complicated set of history, and it's much too complicated for me to recount here. And in fact, there have been comments about how the Mujahideen, as depicted in the film, later I know it's been described as being, they later become the Taliban, and of course we know from recent events from 2001 onwards, 2000 onwards, about of the Taliban. But I would just I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think I just want to just emphasize that I think it's a little bit more complicated than just saying the Mujahideen in this film end up becoming the Taliban later. I think it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more nuanced, although there are connections. And so I would just encourage anyone who's very interested in trying to find out more of that history, and trying to figure out what the connection is between the Mujahideen as fictionally represented in this film, what that representation could lead to in real life terms later on in terms of the history. I would just encourage you to read up on the history if you can, because I think it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. But that's beyond the scope of this particular live stream. But what I wanted to say is that in terms of the Soviet-Afghan conflict at the time, this is in the late 80s, we have the Soviet side essentially in conflict with the Afghan side. Okay, just to put it in very, very simple terms. It's overly simple, I know, but it's the Soviet side, the occupying Soviet forces versus the Afghan side. Okay, and the Afghan side, at least as depicted in this film, is the Mujahideen and Kamran Shah and his forces. So in essence, Kamran Shah is fighting against the colonel who is the head of the Russian air base in Afghanistan. He's fighting against General Pushkin, because General Pushkin is part of the Soviet side. He is fighting against General Koskov, although General Koskov, we understand, is kind of his own rogue general, and he's actually acting in his own self-interest, but it's all a ruse, it's all an act. And Cameron Shaw is in essence fighting against Gogol, who you will see at the very end of the film. And so it's a very confusing thing to see Gogol and Cameron Shaw like shake hands or like greet each other at the concert. It's interesting, but there's actually a little interesting extra thing I want to say about that when we get to at the end of this discussion here. But the point is that, okay, in simplistic terms, the Soviet side and the Afghan side, that's what we have. But there are already points of confusion already if we think about it. Okay, first of all, Koskov, who is still a Soviet general, is making a deal with the Snow Leopard Brotherhood, who, for some connection, I'm not sure exactly which, it's all with like one brief moment that Cameron Shaw says in his dialogue, and it sort of disappears. But the implication is that there is some allegiance, I think, between the Mujahideen as depicted in this film and the Snow Leopard Brotherhood that is selling the opium to this Russian general. So this is very interesting. So if there is an allegiance between the Snow Leopard Brotherhood and the Mujahideen, therefore they can be grouped into the Afghan side. And if that's the case, the Afghan side is antagonistic against the Russian side, and yet the Afghan side, or one component of the Afghan side, is making a deal with a Russian general to sell opium to them in order to get diamonds. That is very interesting. So again, we have this weird dynamic going on at once, which is two sides or two aspects, components of sides that are, I guess, meant to be in conflict against each other, or making a deal with each other to exchange opium for diamonds. Okay, it's all true. It's all in their own self-interest, ultimately, I understand. But that's a very interesting thing. Okay, the next interesting thing is that, right, what happens afterwards? The opium is loaded onto the plane, and the plane eventually is basically stolen by Bond, and it rides off, and leaving Koskov and the destroyed airbase there in Afghanistan. So the assumption, and then the plane eventually, the opium is eventually thrown out into the air, and it's we assume destroyed, right? So what does Whitaker say at the end? So you blew up a $500 million, and then Bond says, mm-hmm. So there's that. So the whole idea, therefore, is that at the end of the day, the money that was paid by the Russian government into the bank account of Brad Whitaker was somehow used to buy the diamonds that was then used to pay this component of the Afghan side. I don't know if it's the Afghan resistance or the Mujahideen, but it was Snow Leopard Brotherhood. These diamonds were then used to pay this aspect of the Afghan side. And so the Russian funds were used to pay the Afghan side, which is essentially their enemy in this conflict. And another thing is that I was trying to allude to earlier is Cameron Shaw is therefore an enemy of the Soviet side. And if that's the case, he is an enemy not just of Pushkin, but he's also an enemy of Gogol, which makes his meeting with Gogol at the very end there, at the end of the concert of Karamilovi in Vienna, very, very strange. You have very, very strange indeed. And Gogol, remember what Gogol says, Gogol's, when M is introducing the two of them, this is Gogol with the Foreign Service, and he says, this is Cameron Shaw. And notice how M doesn't identify Cameron Shaw as being deputy commander of the Eastern District of the Mujahideen. He just says, oh, this is Cameron Shaw. And Gogol says, my pleasure. And notice also that Cameron Shaw doesn't acknowledge Gogol. He just says, oh, where's James? Right? So I always thought that was really interesting. I don't want to make too much of this, but the point is that this is a very weird meeting, if you think about it, because they're enemies, or they're on two sides of a conflict, and they really shouldn't be friendly with each other. But they kind of are, or the assumption is that they are in this moment, but they really shouldn't be. But I think we can not forgive, but I think we can also look at this moment in an also very interesting way, which I think is very realistic. I don't know if this was planned by the filmmakers or not, but Gogol. Right, Gogol is an interesting character too. We know Gogol, the Walter Gotell character. Gogol was a kind of a mainstay in the Roger Moore era films. I mean, we'd seen the actor, of course, play a different character in From Russia with Love, that's for sure. But he plays Gogol from The Spy Who Loved Me, and then Moonraker, and then For Your Eyes Only, and Octopussy, and then A View to a Kill, and then now here he is again in The Living Daylights. And so I think the idea, I understood that one of the original plans of the film was to have the Pushkin character actually be Gogol, and then to have the Gogol character be the subject of this intrigue that ended up being the intrigue that surrounded the character of Pushkin in the final film. But I would like to think what would have happened had Gogol been the character that would have been the subject of all of this intrigue between Koskov and Whitaker and all that, and the fake assassination of Gogol and all that. A character that we've actually grown up to know and really love as a kind of good guy, as an ally, if you will, of Bond, because he's always been an ally of Bond, even in a very ambiguous mode like you only like For Your Eyes Only. Still, he's a kind of comrade, right? And that's what Bond says in For Your Eyes Only. That's détente, comrade. And so Gogol has always been, to varying degrees anyway, a kind of good guy. And he's a good guy here as well. And I don't know if the filmmakers intended this, because Gogol was a character that emerged in the films before Mikhail Gorbachev's rise to power in the Soviet Union, right, in the mid-'80s. But there is a striking resemblance physically between Gogol as a character and Mikhail Gorbachev. And if we understand Soviet history in the mid to late 80s, we can understand also this idea not just of glasnost, but also of détente, and also of the easing of tensions between U.S. and Soviet Union, but also disarmament in Afghanistan of the Soviet occupying forces there began after Gorbachev's rise to power, and it started around the late 80s. And so I can understand, therefore, a kind of interesting, maybe indirect symbolism that can be traced to the presence of Gogol here, and let's say the thawing of tensions between the Afghan side and the Soviet side, as represented by this very brief moment between Gogol, who again looks like Mikhail Gorbachev, or at least there's an impression. He gives off that vibe, a Gorbachev type of vibe. And then Cameron Shah, who again is acknowledged as being part of the Mujahideen. And so even if they're meant to be the antagonistic or enemies against each other, I can also see that there is another echo of history going on, that this is also echoing this type of de-escalation, if you will, that would lead to the official end of the conflict by a couple years from 1987, in fact. And so, but the point is that this is a very complicated plot, right? It's not just complicated in terms of the opium deal and who's doing what, where. The defection plot was really a ruse, and the Soviet-Afghan plot, it makes even more complicated by the sides that are really warring with each other. Factions of them are in actually making deals with each other and all that stuff. Not to mention the fact that we have a British Secret Service agent in here. I guess this is pretty consistent, right, in terms of the Soviet-Afghan conflict being also a proxy war, and Bond essentially allying with Cameron Shah and the Mujahideen, at least as Cameron Shah was leading it. And so I think that is consistent with the unfolding of actual events in history, right? We never see any U.S. presence in this film except for Felix Leiter, who's just basically on a boat the entire time, but and wearing nice sort of summer yacht jackets, but and drinking coffee, I think, but we never see any U.S. presence in the Afghanistan scenes, right? So my point is that this is all very complicated, okay? But I think that's one of the strengths of the film, because don't get me wrong, I love the big Ken Adams set bad guy trying to take over the world, that kind of plot. Bond has to come in and save the day. I love that sort of plot. I think that's really exciting and fun, and very much in keeping with the James Bond appeal. Okay, but I also like James Bond films where it's more down to earth. Allegiances are not so clear cut. There is more gray area. It's not always black and white. There are things about the world that are confusing and complicated. We're not quite sure who our friends are or who our enemies are. We've seen this occasionally in Bond films before this, and we'll see this after this. So I would say, for example, From Russia with Love, that's a great example of not necessarily knowing who is who. And this is all a plot, Spectre plot and all that. It's a kind of a complicated plot. The same is true for The Living Daylights. This is a very complicated plot, not knowing who's who. Is Koskov a friend or an enemy? I mean, it's what Pushkin says in Tangier when Bond confronts him. It's a matter of trust. Who do you believe? Koskov or me? And what Bond says, if I believe Koskov, then we wouldn't be talking here, right? And so I love this idea also of not necessarily knowing who to trust, and it's essentially a leap of faith, and Bond has to rely on his instincts in order to be able to make that leap of faith reasonably well, or to the extent possible. So I like that aspect of this confusion of the world. It's very consistent with espionage and spycraft. We saw a little bit of this also in an earlier Roger Moore film, For Your Eyes Only, the idea of who do we trust? Can we trust this guy or can we trust this guy? And so I like that kind of echoing, because there's as I say, a confusion of allegiances and alliances and who to trust, not knowing who to trust. And in fact, I would say also, it's not necessarily considered one of the stronger Bond films, I get it, but a later film that we will see in the Daniel Craig era is called Quantum of Solace. And don't get me wrong, it's not necessarily my favorite Bond film ever made, but one of the things I really admire about Quantum of Solace is the fact that there's also a muddying of the waters. There is a confusion in that film as well about who to trust, even at the point of dying for some. I don't want to go into too much detail now, but even at the very end, it's difficult to know exactly who to trust, what's going on, what was the agendas of this particular person or that particular person. What is the role of the U.S. government in these? Are they allied with the good guys or the bad guys, or what's going on here? And this confusion, I think, is a really appropriate reflection of real world geopolitical ramifications. And so we don't get this throughout the entirety of the Bond series, but when we do get it in some of the films that I cited, including this one, The Living Daylights, I think it becomes a very exciting, vital thing. And thus, inherently, the plot has to become very complicated, because it has to reflect these real-world ramifications. And so, therefore, I think the confusing aspect of the plot is its strength, in a paradoxical sort of way. And therefore, the confusing aspect of the characters of the bad guys, Koskov and Whitaker, and in particular Koskov, his sort of slimy, two-faced nature, I think is in keeping with this idea of the confusion of the atmosphere and the proceedings. What exactly is going on? We're not quite sure. What is Koskov's plan? We're not quite sure. Is he a good guy or bad guy? Again, we're not quite sure. But I like that. Maybe it makes him less of a diabolical supervillain, like in the Leagues of Goldfinger. Okay, that. If you think that, okay, I can agree with you in that front. But in exchange for that, I think he gains this ambiguity, which I think is itself a very huge strength. And so I find that to be very rich and rewarding. Just to round up the discussion before I go to the live chat, I should just mention too about Whitaker. Whitaker as a character might be seen as being a characterization that might upend the hypothesis that I just posited here, namely because Whitaker himself is actually a very outlandish character, but he's not in the film for very long. So there's that going for him. And I think also Whitaker and Bond don't get enough screen time together, and Whitaker is not necessarily seen being directly handling the whole plot involving the opium and the plane and the airbase, etc. So he's not necessarily seen as kind of a hands-on villain, as a villain like even a Blofeld might have been during the Connery and Lazenby era. And so I think his standoff approach to the whole proceedings makes him less of a threat in an interesting sort of way. Of course, he is a very kind of strange and almost surreal threat at the very end of the film. Don't get me wrong, in this interesting funhouse sequence, which in many ways echoes a certain sequence that can be found in the film The Man with the Golden Gun in Scaramanga's Funhouse, if you know that film. But my point is that Whitaker is still, I think, relegated to, let's say, minor villain status by virtue of the fact that he has less screen time, and also because he is not directly involved in the plot proceedings in terms of the plane and the opium deal in the same way as Necros and Koskov are. So in that sense, my focus is on Koskov primarily, but and then Necros too, which I'll get to in a second. But the fact that I think what's his name? Koskov. Koskov is kind of a slimy, two-faced person, not necessarily of a supervillain status, still makes him a very strong villain. And so, because it's an echo of the reflection of the real-world complications that this film is trying to capture, in some aspect anyway, that the supervillain Bond films weren't necessarily concerned with. So, in that sense, I think that extra baggage of real-world ramifications really makes Koskov's character even more consistently quite an interesting concoction in terms of a villain that Bond has to battle in this particular film. So, but sorry about that. I've just been going on like this for a very long time. So I will go back to the chat and then we will continue from there. So, Chronologic is here. Hello, it's nice to see you. Let's see, just scrolling down. Che Guevara 9 is here. Hello. It's nice to see you, and don't worry about not being able to stick around. It's not a problem at all. Chronologic continues. I love the Dalton Bonds. This movie was awesome. Love the milk delivery scene and that bad guy. Yes, Necros. Okay, so let's just talk about Necros there. So I spoke about Koskov. I spoke a little bit about Whitaker, or I should say in the Dalton turn of phrase, Koskov and Whitaker. So I've spoken about Koskov and Whitaker, but I haven't spoken too much about Necros. Necros is one of those really unforgettable villains. He's another one of those villains with blonde hair. So we've seen blonde-haired villains with varying degrees of success in past and future Bond films, of course. Perhaps the most successful of those blonde-haired villains being Grant in the Robert Shaw character in From Russia with Love. But here we have a character that is very deadly, very physically strong, very physically capable. He is a chameleon in the sense that he can disguise his voice into different accents. We see this in particular in his attack, his single-handed attack on the Bladen safe house, which is a remarkable feat in and of itself if you think about it. He goes in there disguised as a milkman with bottles that are actually grenades, and he subdues, what does he say? His attack ends up killing 2, injuring some others as well. And so, and he single-handedly retrieves Koskov and makes off in the helicopter, and then that's the end. And so that is a really remarkable scene. Of course, he's listening to The Pretenders, Where Has Everybody Gone, on repeat, or it wouldn't be on repeat, but I think it would be a cassette, like a Walkman. It would be a cassette player, so it would have been a cassette tape. So he's probably, for those of you who don't know cassette tapes, they don't have repeat functions like CDs or now with like Apple iTunes or something like that. And so you don't have a repeat button with a cassette tape. But so you have to essentially, I mean, the fact that that song was being played so many times, Where Has Everybody Gone, is probably suggestive of the fact that he probably had that song recorded on the same tape multiple times, so you didn't have to worry about rewinding it. He probably just had that tape, and so that was his assassination music, I suppose, because we also hear that song again in in Vienna just before he kills Saunders, right? And I'm kind of, my comments are slightly in jest, of course, because I understand that this is the leitmotif, the musical leitmotif that John Barry is employing to associate with Necros, right? Because that's what John Barry, the composer, does. He takes a melody or theme that is usually the main theme of the Bond song, or maybe a song that's used elsewhere, and he will use that as a leitmotif for the score for that particular film. And so we hear the melody, the refrain from the Aha song, The Living Daylights, sprinkled occasionally throughout the film. We also hear the instrumental of the theme song, Where Has Everybody Gone? And so the idea is that this song is associated with Necros, but in terms of the headphones and the Walkman. And then also it's therefore associated by John Barry directly on the musical score in terms of that exact same theme. It appears a number of times, quite notably, of course, at the very end in the airplane fight between Bond and Necros. But yes, so Necros is a force to be reckoned with, quite amazingly so. Although I would suggest that maybe as the film goes on, we see less and less of his deadliness, right? Because he's most deadly, in the first half of the film, up to the point where he assassinates Saunders in Vienna. And then after that, there are less opportunities for him to be deadly, because we don't see him in action anymore. He just becomes a kind of henchman, helping check the opium shipment, or doing stuff like that, or just standing around as people are basically, blowing things up around them in the base, etc. And so he has his one last hurrah in terms of the fight with Bond on the plane there, of course. But that's an interesting thing too, right? Apparently he had a knife in his jacket, which he pulls out not at the point where he could have stabbed Bond in the back, but he pulls it out at the point when they're both hanging off of the net there, as the opium bags are being blown, when the back of the plane is open and they're both hanging for dear life. And that's when he decides to pull out the knife and try to stab Bond. Not before, but I'd like to think that maybe, I don't know, maybe Necros was a bit of a sadist, and that's why he decided not to go with the quick kill of the knife, but rather go with the trying to strangle Bond with some netting. Which led to that fight. But Kara unintentionally intervened, of course, with her little pulling down of the lever, causing the back door to open, of course. And so there's that. But so that's Necros' last hurrah, as it were. And he's very strong, he's very physically capable, but of course, at the end, he got the boot. And so it wasn't enough to overcome someone like Bond. And incidentally, I love the strategy that Bond employs during this whole fight when they're basically hanging for dear life at the end there. Bond goes under this opium, net of opium bags. He goes under the bags, right? And he goes up on the underneath part, and he's waiting for Necros, who's climbing on the outer part. And as Necros climbs up, Bond waits for his chance and then punches him through the netting and causes Necros to fall down a little. I love that, how Bond is strategically using the underside of this netting in order to wait for Necros and strike at just the right moment. I thought that was very clever. And then there's that. But anyway, so there's Necros, and again, what a formidable villain. Granted, perhaps he's more deadly and more formidable in the first part of the film rather than the second part of the film, but still a wholly memorable villain, and one of the greats in the pantheon of James Bond villains, in my opinion. But his presence is a really ominous one, and made even more ominous by the Pretenders and Where Has Everyone Gone? Where Has Everybody Gone? So really wonderful stuff. Okay, so let's see. Kubrick Lover 1972 says that guy who is the arms dealer in this film, I think, would later play Felix Leiter in some of the Pierce Brosnan films. At least I think so. Not Felix Leiter per se. He plays Wade in the Pierce Brosnan, not all the Pierce Brosnan films, but he plays Wade. Quite memorably, of course, in GoldenEye and Muffy, right? And he also appears in Tomorrow Never Dies, but. the same character does. But yeah, but it's not Felix Leiter in the Pierce Brosnan era. But it's kind of the Felix Leiter role. You're absolutely right. Irwin says it's pretty incredible that Dalton was considered as Bond for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which is almost 20 years before. Yes, yes. Che Guevara 9 says, loved this movie and Timothy Dalton is my favorite Bond. Wolfgrat says, this is one of my favorite Dalton performances. It's up there with his King of France in The Lion in Winter. Yes. Zyrotha says, Jordan Baker. Yes, he's in GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. Tomahawk 238 says, pre-title sequence to this one was the most memorable part for me. Just amazing. Yes, the war game sequence off of the Rock of Gibraltar, right? I love that part. Please pardon me for my poor pronunciation, but I love it when the guy says, hold on, you're dead. I love that moment. The whole thing with I love that they're playing war games at this. The British government is essentially playing war games. And how does the film end? The film ends with a kind of a war game that Whitaker is playing by himself in his home in Tangier. So war game at the beginning, war game at the end there. So I really love that. Let's see, just scrolling down here. Let's see. Just scrolling down here. Yes, Erwin says, and we will come to it later, but in the stream, I'm sure. But Felix Leiter in The Living Daylights is the absolute worst in the franchise, in my opinion. The actor is just terrible. Yeah, actually the whole Felix Leiter stuff and the women who work with him, that whole sequence I think is a little bit. Yeah, it could have been a little bit better. I agree. But Felix Leiter and that stuff is probably considered probably very minor. So Felix Leiter. It really depends. Sometimes we get Felix Leiter films involving Felix Leiter where he plays a really integral role, and in other films where his role is understandably and maybe minor. So Felix Leiter is arguably more integral in films like Dr. No or Goldfinger, or definitely License to Kill, definitely, and maybe to some extent also Thunderball. His role is probably arguably quite minor in films like Diamonds Are Forever and things like that. Maybe even Live and Let Die, although if we think about the License to Kill connection, maybe Live and Let Die can be considered one of the more integral Felix Leiter roles. But this one in The Living Daylights could be classified as being one of the minor ones. Simply because of his real lack of screen time. There is, in terms, I don't want to talk too much about the performance per se, but just talking about the role of the Felix Leiter character in this narrative, all he is doing is spying on Whitaker. That's all he's doing. He doesn't add anything in terms of the Afghanistan plot. He doesn't add anything necessarily, I think, in terms of the General Pushkin or the Smyrna plot, at least not that we see portrayed on screen anyway. Maybe he has information that he tells Bond that we aren't privy to because the film cuts to something else. I don't know, but right. And I would say as a little bit of an interesting thing, there's that thing that happens in these sorts of spy films where you have Bond who is basically he's in the car with the women trying to escape from having assassinated Pushkin, and he's in the car with the women, promising a fun time at a party, and is the party still on, that sort of thing. And then one of them pulls a gun on him, and the ruse is that they're all working for Felix Leiter, and they know this is James Bond, but they pull a gun on him anyway, just to make him go to the boat, because he probably wouldn't have gone on his own volition. But that's the sort of thing. But they're good guys, but they still pull a gun on him just so that they can get him to a location and then meet another good guy, and then everyone is recognized as being all on the same team and that sort of thing. So, but they meet at first at gunpoint, and this always reminds me of how Bond first met and made acquaintances with his allies in the film Dr. No and how he first met Felix Leiter there, and also Quarrel and all these people, again, at gunpoint. And so, but they ended up being his allies, and rather strong ones too. And so I like that in a kind of interesting way. This is echoing or paralleling that kind of entrance into the allies of Bond. You know, sometimes Bond meets his allies not with a handshake, but with at the end of a gun. But even so, they end up being friends. So I like that echoing of Dr. No in that regard. But you're absolutely right in terms of Felix Leiter as a character playing a very minor role. You know, even his contribution in terms of allowing Bond to infiltrate the Tangiers home of Whitaker at the very end there, I would say is very. It's not the most essential thing, I think, but it gives Felix Leiter something to do. But yes, arguably the Felix Leiter aspect of this plot is not the most significant part of the plot, in my opinion. And so I don't mind the fact that it's maybe a lesser part, because it's not really significant to the plot, and it doesn't last very long anyway, and that's pretty much it. And so the main focus of the film is Bond and Koskov and Kara and Necros, and to a certain extent Whitaker, and so Felix Leiter doesn't play into that equation directly at all. So it doesn't bother me too much anyway. But I do acknowledge what you're saying about Felix Leiter and his role there. Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Oh, mainly movies is here. Yes. Staying in on vacation. Now that's some Bond dedication there. Yes, I have to. My work schedule is still a little bit. It's still a little bit not up in the air necessarily, but I'm staying in for the first part of this coming week anyway, so I can wake up a little bit later tomorrow, so that's good. And let's see. Zyrother then mentions Bliss. Bliss was okay, not bad, not memorable. This is in reference to Caroline Bliss, who plays Miss Moneypenny in this film. And so that's an interesting thing too. Again, we have to assume that with all the changes that came with the new Bond and Timothy Dalton, there had to be changes elsewhere. And I think one of the changes was Lois Maxwell not reprising her role as Miss Moneypenny that she had in almost, what was it? She was, right, she was all the way up to A View to a Kill. And so now we had Caroline Bliss, who was here and also in License to Kill. Again, it's not. I think it's a tough role because it's not really the, how should I put it? It's not the most significant role in the entire film, of course. And in many ways, it might seem to be somewhat of a thankless role because there's very little to do. And so there hasn't been necessarily a kind of chemistry that has been established yet between Caroline Bliss's Miss Moneypenny and Timothy Dalton's James Bond. And so I think all that she can do is talk about her Barry Manilow records and sigh at a particular moment and readjust her glasses and that sort of thing. I think this is another aspect of the Bond Timothy Dalton era that needed another film. It would have been nice to have another film just to further explore this relationship between Caroline Bliss's Miss Moneypenny and Timothy Dalton's James Bond. We get a little bit of it in License to Kill, of course, just a little bit of it, but what was I saying? But not that much. And I think, yeah, that if anything needed a third film, I think it was Timothy Dalton, for anything, just to further help to explore this relationship between Caroline Bliss's Miss Moneypenny and Timothy Dalton's James Bond. But again, it's another part of the film that I think is, how should I put it? There are echoes of other of the films in the past, but there are also ways in which the film is trying to do something new in terms of casting, etc. And this is one of those things. Same thing with Felix Leiter. Were they going to use the same Felix Leiter? Oh, obviously they didn't when we look at the next film, but License to Kill. But I guess, yeah, I mean, these sorts of things happen with casting. Sometimes it works immediately, sometimes it needs more time, and perhaps it needs more time than was actually afforded to the entire franchise or the Timothy Dalton run to begin with. So, but these things happen, of course. But I think for what it's worth, I think it's it's certainly not terrible, and I think it was not bad. So it was a good performance, I think, of Miss Moneypenny. But again, it's not the main focus, at least as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to a discussion of this film. But it's one of the appealing parts of the James Bond world, of course. But one carryover that is consistent, of course, is Desmond Llewellyn's Q, and I think the Q scene is very charming, very Q-like. And it's one of the best Q scenes in the series, I think, because it has all these cool inventions. I love his remote control thing. He pushes a button and it clicks, and the doors in the back close. It has the little thing with the revolving sofa and all that, and so and he shows off the key ring and the winterizing of the Aston Martin, which is great to see return. And then also we have the excuse me, the key ring, which of course is the explosive, and is also the stun gas, and then also the key itself opens 90% of the world's locks or something. So yeah, so I love the Q scene very much. I think it's Desmond Llewellyn and Timothy Dalton have a really good chemistry, I think. But and it would have been nice. And actually, I think that chemistry carries through very nicely into the second film, License to Kill. And so it would have been nice to see that relationship between Q and Timothy Dalton's Bond further mature in a third film. Again, it was never going to happen. It never came to pass, but it would have been nice. It's nice to think what could have happened with Miss Moneypenny and also with Q. Let's see. All right, so let's see here. Okay. Just scrolling down the chat here. Okay. Oren Tickler says, those other 00 agents in Gibraltar are a joke. Yes, so 004 and 002. There's also reference to 008 in Hong Kong. Yeah, I mean, we never see, we see sometimes in the James Bond films other 00 agents. We see, right, in Thunderball, we see like some background shots, the backs of people's heads or the chairs of people, and they're meant to be the 00 section. And we see 002 and 004. I think it's 004 who gets assassinated by the assassin here. Yeah, we don't see too much action on their behalves, of course. And then we just get a passing reference to 008 in Hong Kong by M. But we never see 008. I mean, this isn't the first time in a James Bond film where we get reference to 008, of course, I think, referred to most famously by Bernard Lee's M in Goldfinger, of course. But what was I saying? So yeah, but I think, this is a James Bond film, 007 film. It's not necessarily a 00 film. And we don't necessarily see, I mean, these films, at least maybe the exception perhaps being the film GoldenEye. For the most part, we don't see other 00 agents in their prime or just acting out in these sorts of ways that are similar to James Bond, because James Bond is meant to be the hero and all the attention is meant to be on him. But again, as I say, probably the closest exception to that is GoldenEye, so that's interesting. Let's see. All right, so just scrolling through. Let's see. Yeah. But yeah, Wolfgrat says, well, they caught the other 00 agents unprepared, and the guy in the kitchen was pretty good, I thought. Yeah, so you're talking about the Bladen Safe House fight in the kitchen. Green 4 to base, right? Green 4 to base. So Green 4. And he seemed to be, I don't know what his status was. On the one hand, he seemed to be a servant at Bladen Safe House, but at the same time, he was also he put up a good fight. I mean, he ended up losing the battle against Necros, but he put up a pretty good fight, I thought. And so it seemed like he was well trained in some kind of self-defense, or he was and that sort of thing. So I don't know if he was an agent per se, but he was definitely well trained. This is also consistent with the fact that perhaps, as we know, British Secret Service also employed people who used to be in military service, and so it wouldn't surprise me that maybe these people who worked at Blade and Safe House, this particular manservant, or the other people who worked on the grounds wearing groundskeeper uniforms and the like, it wouldn't surprise me if they had themselves military backgrounds and they were employed by the British government to guard Blade and Safe House, but weren't necessarily part of the British Secret Service. So I don't know what their connections are with MI6, but at the very least we can say that they're members of Her Majesty's government. So, well, yes. Chronologic says the plot of Living Daylights is intricate, agreed, awesome geopolitics in it. Yes, I agree. Glowing to Hobbit says, oh, hi, Daisuke. Let's see. Wolfgrat says, well, for a mere employee, he was great. If he'd lived, I'd promote him. Yes. Let's see. I like the, I like the, there's another echo to Daniel Craig's James Bond, in that there's a great moment after Bond has assassinated Pushkin and in Tangiers. And so do you remember that moment where Necros is about to do the assassination because he's been ordered by Whitaker to Necros has been ordered by Whitaker to assassinate Pushkin if Bond has not done so by a certain amount of time. Well, we understand that perhaps that certain amount of time has elapsed, and so now Necros is about to take it upon himself to assassinate Pushkin in order to move the plot along, and in order for Koskov and Whitaker to consummate the transaction that they have planned with the Snow Leopard Brotherhood in Afghanistan. Okay, so he's about to shoot Pushkin in Tangiers when all of a sudden he hears shots ring out from another part of the room, and Pushkin is seen being shot when he's at the podium. And then what does Necros do? He's at the spotlight somewhere, and then he turns the spotlight onto James Bond, and then James Bond does that. It's one of the shots that you see in all the trailers. He's got his sort of a beige coat on, and he turns to the spotlight and he does that thing with the gun. That is such a cool. That is the gun barrel sequence right there. I mean, the actual gun barrel sequence that's used in the film The Living Daylights, I would say it's not the most impressive gun barrel sequence. It's a little bit stiff, and it's stiff by the fact that, you know, Timothy Dalton in the gun barrel sequence that's used, he doesn't move his right arm. He keeps his right arm just very rigid while he just moves his left arm. So you can tell that he's hiding his gun. And then as he turns, his gun is in his right arm, and he turns to the gun barrel. So I always, to be perfectly clear, I love Timothy Dalton, don't get me wrong, but I always thought that the gun barrel that was used was a little bit underwhelming. But that's also because I compare it to the real gun barrel sequence, which is found in the middle of the film, which is found in the sequence at the assassination of Pushkin in Tangiers, when Necros shines the spotlight on him. That's when the gun barrel is. And then the way that he turns and does that thing with his arm extended and shooting at the light, that is the electrifying gun barrel turn of the body that I think makes Timothy Dalton's James Bond so wonderful. So always in my head, I always thought that this was the gun barrel sequence that personifies Timothy Dalton's James Bond in my eyes, much more than the actual gun barrel sequence that was used at the very start of the film. But I bring up Daniel Craig's James Bond too, because as you know, in Casino Royale, there's a real clever use of the gun barrel sequence employed in the reality of the scene. And so I always like to think that we have the gun barrel sequence played out in the reality of the scene in both a Daniel Craig James Bond film, Casino Royale, and a Timothy Dalton James Bond film, Living Daylights. And while I'm on the topic of Daniel Craig for a minute, let me just say, I don't want to go into too much detail about the Daniel Craig James Bond films. Hopefully, I'll try to make room later in the year in live streams for discussions of the other Daniel Craig James Bond films. But let me just say that I see so many parallels between Timothy Dalton's approach to James Bond and Daniel Craig's approach to James Bond and the characterizations that they each have generated with respect to this particular fictional character, I think have a lot of similarities between them. There is a certain no-nonsense attitude that both have. Bond by Craig's Bond and also Dalton's Bond both mean business. Business first, pleasure comes later. And we see this, I think, personified at the very outset in the pre-credit sequence that I was referring to earlier. But of course, after business has been concluded and he gets contacted HQ and tells them that he will report in an hour, better make that 2, then he makes room for pleasure after business. Let me put it that way. And so I find that that kind of that's an interesting parallel with Craig's Bond as well, who also exhibited this idea of business first and then pleasure. Also, the idea that I mentioned earlier in the pre-credit sequence, Bond is seen running through one of the guards because he's so intent on getting his target, which is the assassin who is trying to make his getaway. And this reminds me very much also of a sequence in Casino Royale where Daniel Craig is trying to get at his target. And what does he do? He essentially just runs through a wall. I mean, it's not a guard like it was in the Living Daylights, but it's running through a wall. So it's almost like there's a total disregard for things around them because they're in the way of their ultimate objective, which is trying to apprehend the guy that is getting away. And so I like that parallel as well. There's also a sense of kind of the real world threat come home, and there's also an idea of Bond acting on his wits and being very dangerous and being very flippant almost. And I find that there are really strong echoes of Timothy Dalton's James Bond in a lot of the stuff that Daniel Craig does. Don't get me wrong, Daniel Craig has his own take on the character, of course, that is very independent of Dalton and the other actors. Of course, that's true. The same for everyone. Dalton's approach is independent of all the other actors as well. That's also true. But I like to think that there are some echoes and parallels that we can say between Timothy Dalton's Bond and Daniel Craig's Bond. So much so that the point that I would actually be encouraged to say that, you know, anyone who likes Daniel Craig's James Bond, I think probably would also like Timothy Dalton's James Bond, in the sense that there are enough parallels between the two approaches of performance such that if you like this kind of Bond, then you will probably like Timothy Dalton's Bond as well. So, anyway, yeah. So here we go. So thank you. All right, so just continuing on, and let's see. All right. Okay, so I wrote there's making a comment about the bird that was in the Blade and Safe House. That's a reference to the film For Your Eyes Only. Yes. Let's see here. Yes. Speaking of Q, excuse me here while I take a sip of water here. Let's see here. Yes, there's discussion about actors who appear in this film who have also appeared in other films. Yes. So let's see here. Sorry. Just scrolling through here the chat. I'm just doing my very best here. But okay, let's see. Yes. Okay. Let's see. Sorry about this. I've lost my place. But I will just keep on going. Sorry about this. This happens, this sometimes you have to, here we go. Okay. Let's see. All right. OX24 Riders here. Hello. Greetings from Southwest London, Daisuke. It's nice to see you, my friend. Zyrother says, Dalton feels vulnerable and not invincible like Moore and Brosnan. Yes, I didn't mention, but there's a great moment in the film The Living Daylights where after Saunders has been assassinated in Vienna, you see the balloon fly into the screen, and the balloon says on this really kind of creepy looking cursive writing in black marker, it says Smeert Spionem, and then Bond takes the balloon, and the balloon never had a chance, right? It never had a chance. Ugh! And it just does that thing, that wonderful Dalton balloon crush. And so, yeah, that is a wonderful moment. It's just such a perfect encapsulation of Dalton's Bond. It's this just rage that must be that must have its outlet somewhere, and just for that poor balloon, yeah, it just again the balloon never had a chance. But oh well, I love that moment. Yeah, it's a really great moment. It's just a great example of how Timothy Dalton uses his rage and makes that into a really great positive for his performance as Bond in the character. Let's see. Chris D is here. Hello, my friend. It's nice to see you. Let's see. Let's see. Chronologic says, does Daisuke script any of this? The flow is great. If this is off the cuff, that's amazing. Oh yes, thank you very much. Yes, there's no script. I tend to think a little bit ahead of time. Earlier this afternoon, I was thinking, oh, I'll try to talk about this, this, and this, but no, there's no script at all. So I have rely a lot on the flow of the conversation in the live chat as well. Let's see. Yeah, Erwin says, Dalton is a great actor, but unfortunately he got dealt a really bad hand when it comes to the one-liners. Yeah, but I would suggest, as I tried to suggest earlier, that it's not true for all of the one-liners. I think some of them fall flat, but there are a number of them that, excuse me, there are a number of them that I think work to his advantage, or that he works to his advantage, let me put it that way. So yeah, and Zyroth says he got the boot, but that's a funny line. But as I say also, it's manipulated in the editing in a way such that it can be treated as a one-liner, but also it's a Dalton moment, because this is where he's still no nonsense, because as he's saying it, he's trying to basically go to the cockpit and take control of the plane so it doesn't crash into the mountain. So I love that. I described it earlier in the live chat as being kind of passing of the torch moment between Moore's Bond era and then Timothy Dalton's Bond era. So there's that. And there are moments like that too. I mean, this is sort of a miscellaneous comment, but just little things about this film that I find really appealing. While I'm on the topic of the airplane, earlier when Bond is trying to get off the runway, lift off as another plane is approaching, which is a ludicrous moment, absolutely ludicrous. I love how he's trying to get the plane off the ground and the music is swelling and everything like that. And you see him like shaking and his head is shaking. He's like, come on, let's get it up there. I love that moment. And we see a similar moment with Pierce Brosnan's Bond at the very beginning of GoldenEye, in terms of when he's trying to control an airplane. We see a similar type of moment, but this moment by Timothy Dalton, I always thought was so, it was that extra shot at the end of him, seeing him shaking his head as he's trying to pull the plane off, lift it off from the ground just enough to miss the landing plane. So I always thought that was great. And then another kind of moment that always reminded me of GoldenEye later was when the plane lands and it crashes through the truck that Koskov is driving, and the whole thing explodes, right? It explodes. And you see that huge explosion. You think, oh gosh, Koskov, that's it. He's had it. He's gone. And he's gone. But no, a second later, we see him still alive, and he's got this thing with his hand. He's going, and he falls out, and then the thing explodes again. And then we see him on the ground, just looking at just pure frustration and disgust and defeat, because he sees the plane goes off. But I always thought that was like, you see the whole thing explode in this ball of fire, and you think, oh gosh, Koskov could never have survived that, but he did. Amazingly, he did. That was really quite incredible. That reminds me also of the very infamous moment. I don't want to go into too much detail lest you haven't seen it, but there's a similar moment that happens in the film GoldenEye in terms of a villain that undergoes a certain situation, and you think at the end of the situation, oh gosh, he couldn't have survived that, but he did, to leave room for just one extra little zinger at the end, I suppose. But yeah, I'm always, that moment always amazes me. It's like, oh gosh, Koskov survived that. I couldn't believe it. So, oh well. I guess it was meant to be giving room for that final confrontation, if you will, between Koskov and Pushkin at the very end there in Whitaker's house in Tangier. So, so in that sense, we needed Koskov to survive, I suppose, in order to give closure to the arc, the Pushkin plot arc. So, I guess I can kind of understand that. Also, as when we're talking about the plane sequence, I love the moment too where Kara is driving alongside the plane as it's still on the runway. And she's saying, James, and it's Bond notices through the side window there, and what does he do? He says like, he does that hand gestures, and he's frustrated. And then there's a moment he's like, Kara doesn't get it. Again, you can understand if you see someone doing this, I wouldn't get it at first too, but you see the frustration. He's like, oh. I love that moment. He's not only doing that wonderful gesture but then you see him frustrated at the end there too. I thought that was such a great moment, such a typical Dalton moment to show frustration at this moment there. I think that's so great. Also, there are always little details that I always found kind of quirky and rather endearing about this film and how it's staged. So one example is in the ice, what's called the Aston Martin chase, the ice chase that then turns into the cello sled chase. When the police forces are chasing them on the ice, I guess tractors or whatever they're called, with the little tractor-like wheels there. I love how the lineup of people of the force, the police force, or the people that are chasing Bond and Kara, and they're lined up there with their guns. And I love how they're all moving in like together in one line as the vehicle is going over the rough terrain of the snow. And I love that moment. I always thought that was such a cool visual moment as they're trying to chase Bond and Kara through the snowy slopes there. And also there's a real quirky moment too. Did you notice this? After Bond and Kara have arrived in Vienna, do you remember how they arrive in Vienna? They arrive by truck. They've apparently hitchhiked, and so they're on the back of a truck, and the truck arrives in Vienna. This is after the scene where Pushkin, there's a scene where Pushkin is seen arriving in Tangiers, and he's going to Whitaker's house, and he's saying, and I want you to return the $50 million to us in 48 hours. I don't know what you and Koskov are up to, but it's over. And then it cuts to Bond and Kara arriving in Vienna, again in the back of the truck, apparently by hitchhike. And they get out the truck, they go look, they don't go to the front of the truck, but they kind of look to the front and they say thank you. And you know what the truck driver does? He doesn't turn his head and he goes like this. You just see an arm stick out of the window, and it just goes like this, like that. I always thought that was one of the funniest things in the world. And so I always, whenever someone asks me, what is your favorite James Bond quote, or do you have a quote from a James Bond film that you really like? And I always think, I like this one, and I go like this. And not many people get the reference, but whenever I do this, this is meant to be this reference to this particular moment in The Living Daylights, when the truck driver gives them the thumbs up as they get off the truck, and then they next catch a taxi, and they ride through the streets of Vienna. But I always thought that was a really weird and quirky and cool moment, that truck driver thumbs up. We never see his face, we never see who he is, but I thought that was really great. And let's see, oh gosh, there are so many. Oh, there's another thing too. I should say that on the one hand, and this is another point of sort of miscellaneous point, and after this I'll start to wind down the discussion, because it is approaching 2 a.m. here. But I am a really great admirer of the way in which the James Bond Cara Mallovi relationship develops in this film. I love how Bond kind of is really deceiving Cara, pretending to be a friend of Georgy Koskov's. In essence, just trying to get as much information from her as possible, but also at the same time kind of falling in love with her along the way. And I love the way that it plays out. I think I love it so much that I miss I think there should have been a scene between Bond and Cara that should have taken place in between the point in time in the film where they are in Vienna and after Saunders has been killed, and then the point in time in the film later where we see Cara practicing the cello in the room in Tangiers, and the assumption, we understand that she's called Whitaker and has talked to Koskov, and Koskov has convinced her that Bond is a KGB agent, and so the plan is to drug Bond to render him unconscious, and so this is part of the plan. So these scenes, right after the Vienna scene, the next time we see Cara is the scene in the Tangier kind of hotel room where he poisons Bond. We don't get any scene in between, and so I always thought that the film could have benefited from an extra scene in between these 2 points, showing more of the kind of the disintegration, if you will, of the relationship between Bond and Cara. Again, I think it just needed something, because as much as I really love the relationship, I think that turn that Cara takes, and she betrays Bond, because we understand that she talked to Koskov directly by phone. I think we as audience members just needed a little bit something, maybe just an extra scene, just to further help us understand the reason behind her turn. If we had that scene, or if we had a little scene between her and Bond to show a little bit of the shifting dynamics of their relationship, I think that would have made that particular moment even stronger, and it would have helped, therefore, to make us understand why she ended up turning back and allying herself with Bond at the end. And she says, "I've been such a fool." And they hold hands in the airplane there, and he says, "We both have." And they open the little container there, and they see the heart and the diamonds hidden in the ice. But I always thought that part was a little bit, it needed a little bit something more in order to help us fully understand with more emotional connection just why Kara makes those two decisions that she does at this particular moment. I'm glad she makes them because it means that she is allied with Bond, and I like the fact that she is a good guy in this whole film, and that she helps him along the way, etc. But it would have been nice to see a little bit more of that development. I understand that. I do also appreciate that this is already a long enough film as it is. It's already over 2 hours. And so perhaps to have even more stuff between the character of Bond and the character of Kara might have been just doing too much to the running time. But just personally, I would have loved to see just maybe one more scene or half a scene or something, just to further help to explain why she made the turn that she did. I think there's enough material in the film there already to make us understand why she made the turn. But I'm just saying, as a means of allowing us more of an emotional connection with her vis-a-vis the relationship that she has with Bond, I think it would have been interesting. But oh well, it's a very minor point from my point of view, and still it doesn't affect my overall view of the relationship as it's depicted in this film between Bond and Kara, which I think is one of the strengths of the film. Also, I would have maybe tried to play up a little more of the sexual tension between or the love triangle that could have developed among Bond, Karamalov, and Koskov. As it happens, Koskov as a character is painted such that he doesn't really care about Karamalov, and in fact, he would rather see her dead because, according to Bond, she knows too much, and so that's why the assumption is that's why he arranged for her. He asked her to be the sniper in Bratislava at the beginning of the film, the assumption being that he wanted Bond to kill her in order to help clean up this whole plot, in order to eliminate one other person who might have known more than he or she would have liked. And so, right, we understand that Koskov has very cold feelings towards Karamalov, but I'd like to think that maybe, I mean, there is already a kind of a love triangle among these three characters. We see it played out very, very strikingly in these two scenes that I pointed out, the one in the Tangier, I guess, hotel room, and the one earlier in Vienna in the Prater Park, just after Saunders has been killed, and after this very devastating moment, Kara can think of nothing else except to say, "Did you hear from Georgi, or Yorgi, Koskov?" And I can I'd like to imagine that maybe at that moment Bond also feels not just frustration and anger after what has just happened to Saunders, but also what maybe there might have been a hint of sexual jealousy, because she is still thinking of Koskov, even though they have, in essence, made a sort of emotional connection on the Ferris wheel and all that. And so I would like to think that there would be, but the film doesn't really play up this love triangle that much, except to this extent. And I thought maybe I'd like to think of the possibility that had the film played that angle up a little bit more, maybe it could have created an even stronger a stronger sense of antagonism between Bond and Koskov, thus making Koskov a more formidable adversary than he already is as depicted in the final film product. And so it's always nice to wonder what these things would be like. But overall, I think without that kind of embellishment, I think the film still works. And as I was suggesting before, it's one of my favorite Bond films. And it's not just one of my favorite Bond films. It's probably in... It's definitely in my top 5. It is probably in my top 3. So it's a really great one, and I really love it. So anyway, but even in terms of loving this film, I do think that it's always nice to think, oh, what if this or what if that, and that might go towards some things that I think are kind of maybe not the strong points of this film. And I do acknowledge that this film isn't perfect. But even with what I consider to be its flaws, I still think it works really, really well as a great, exciting engine of the Timothy Dalton Bond approach. Let's see. Just keep on going. And Let's see here. X24 Rider says, Dalton was the man. Shame he couldn't have done more Bond films. Yes, I agree. Mainly Movie says, I agree about the humor. It's a very different brand of humor from Moore, but not bad. Zyrother says, the car chokes was tongue-in-cheek and almost self-parody. Yes, salt corrosion. But the one that I mentioned earlier that I like is, I have a few optional extras installed. Yeah, I like that. Let's see. Yeah, Cooper Glover 1972 says, Daisuke, the deadpan delivery of Dalton with the humorous one-liners, I agree, doesn't match up to Moore's one-liners. Some people don't like that about Moore, but I think that's what makes Moore stand out for me. Yes, and X24 Rider says, yes, I agree. But I also, as I was trying to indicate earlier, I think that there are some moments in the film that are very much more Roger Moore's Bond, but there are other moments that are Timothy Dalton's Bond. And I go to the comedy, the great line that Timothy Dalton gives after Kara says after they've defeated the jail attendant. She says, you're fantastic, we're free. And then James Bond says, Kara, we're inside a Russian airbase in the middle of Afghanistan. So I think that's one of the funniest lines in the film, and but it doesn't feel like a Roger Moore line. It feels like that's a Timothy Dalton humor line, and so I love it. But it's not a double entendre. It's not a pun, but it's kind of the truth, and I love that delivery. I think that's really great. Let's see. So my point is that when one says one-liners, I think what I do in my head is I think there are different types of one-liners. Let me put it that way. And I think there are different types of lines that are meant to be jokes. And I think depending on the type, one can classify it as a Roger Moore type of line, or one can classify it as being a Timothy Dalton type of line. And so I think in that way, I think that some of the lines work. Some of the lines don't work, but many of the lines do work. So let me put it that way. Let's see. Just scrolling down here. Sorry if I'm skipping over some comments. Let's see. Okay, so I'm just scrolling down. Sorry, let's see here. Let's see. Interesting. So I'm just trying to catch up with the comments here. I think I'm at the point where I was mentioning about Dalton, and for the most part, this film is about Dalton and Kara, and that there are no other female characters that have a kind of romantic interest relationship with Bond. But I think Cooper Glover says there are a few Bond girls in this film, Daisuke in Africa. I wouldn't call. I know what you're talking about. There's a quick shot where Bond is running across the rooftops after he has. He looks like he's assassinated Pushkin, and there's a quick shot of some Bond girls in a little square there at the bottom, the ground level, but and actually there's very famous, not famous, but there's a picture of Timothy Dalton. It's not from the film, but it's from the shooting, and he's sitting there with his head in his hand, and these girls around him, and I think these girls are these girls that are in this courtyard at the ground level, but I wouldn't classify them actually as being romantic interests of James Bond in this film. Right, on the contrary, we don't ever see Bond ever meeting them, and so I wouldn't necessarily call them Bond girls, actually. But yeah. So there are and you also mentioned the two women in the car, but I wouldn't call them. I wouldn't mention them. I don't think that there is a relationship between those two women and Bond as well. They are obviously working with Felix Leiter. And so, and then that's basically it. And so I don't necessarily consider them. I mean, there are women in a James Bond film, of course, but my point is that it's not that there aren't any other women in this film. It's that there aren't any other romantic interests or characters in this film for James Bond other than Kara, and to some extent maybe the pre-credit sequence at the beginning, the woman who's calling Margot. But yeah. So let's see here. But I understand what you're saying, of course, in terms of the appearance of these women in the film, which I completely agree with, of course. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, Jay Betty is here. So Connor talking about different James Bond actors. That's really great. Let's see here. X2, yes, X24 Rider. Yes, the way he says, stuff my orders. Ah, you're so right. I love that in the car at the very end of the first sequence. He's talking to Saunders. I stuff my orders, right? Whoever she was, it must have scared the living daylights out. You're right. I love the way he says, stuff my orders. Right, it's in many ways echoing George Lazenby's Bond, because never in a past Bond film, except for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, did Bond ever come close to talking about retiring or quitting or leaving or wanting to get fired. Right, there's a famous scene early on in the George Lazenby film where he almost quits the British Secret Service. Right, and so. I love that. That's kind of an echo of George Lazenby's James Bond, but there's something about, yes, the way he says stuff my orders. I think that's really great. Yeah, there's just something wonderful about Timothy Dalton's line delivery. It's not just about the one-liners and the jokes, but it's just his line delivery in general, and the way he can take seemingly ordinary words and turn them into Timothy Dalton magic, I think, is absolutely extraordinary. And it's just what you said. It's a kind of a simple, almost throwaway phrase, stuff my orders. There's something so like, I'm not sure what it is. That's a typical British idiom, right? Stuff my orders. One doesn't necessarily say that in United States English, I think. And so there's a certain sense of really cool sort of Britishness about that. But there's also a sense of a kind of a strong, almost guttural feeling that he gives to a word like that, stuff my orders. Or in the documentary, Oliver Harper and Duncan Casey really make point of this, of how he says the word Superman. I mean, he's not a Superman. And I mentioned it before, how he just says Koskov and Whitaker, and I love I love when he says the hotelier in Vienna, in the hotel, will you be needing your ordinary suite? And he says, no, I'll need one with a second bedroom. And I love how he says second bedroom. There's something rather halting about that. Just he has to emphasize the fact that he needs a second bedroom. But I just love how he says, I'll need one with a second bedroom. And I love and actually also another sort of miscellaneous point. It's sort of related, but I also love the way he says, Section 26, Paragraph 5, need to know. Sure, you understand. And it just the window as it closes just cuts him off at the very tail end of that. and he drives off as he's sort of talking back to Saunders, which is a great comeback, because Saunders has been a little bit of an annoying character in terms of his sort of haughtiness and being really irritating, and not necessarily he's too, what's the phrase, too stuffy. And so Bond throws back that line at him, and it's such a great, glorious moment. And then Saunders returns again in the middle of the film, but then he becomes an ally, right? He says, I have nothing to lose except my pension. And so I think that's such a great turn of events. And so I love the evolution of the Saunders character from a bit of a stuffy agent who doesn't like Bond to someone who ends up being on Saunders' side. And that makes that moment between the two of them at the end there, when Bond says, and Saunders, thanks. And that thanks has a lot of weight and meaning to it, which makes his death even more tragic. So I really like that moment. I understand too that in order to make his death have more meaning, you needed to have his character be a sympathetic one. And then once you have a sympathetic character, and if you kill him off in the film as a narrative technique, that makes that particular moment even more of a dramatic one. And so I understand the need, narratively speaking, to have his character be less of an annoying character and more of a sympathetic one. And so I understand that term, but still, nonetheless, as an emotional effect, I think it's a really great one. And so, but that's stuff my orders. That's what he says to Saunders, which I really love. So well done, X24 Rider. Well done. I think that's great. Let's see. Let's see here. Just keep on scrolling down here. Erwin says, talking about Koskov and saddens me because Krabbe is a fellow countryman of mine, but he's pretty weak and uninteresting here if you ask me. Yeah, that's a good point. And I was trying to explain that criticism, and how I think one could also see his relatively unsupervillain-like status when compared to other Bond villains of the past, like Drax and Goldfinger. One can still see, paradoxically, how he is very fitting in terms of this kind of film because of the intricacies of the plot and the references to current events and geopolitical matters that are inherently confusing, mysterious, ambiguous. And so to have a film that's dealing with confusing, mysterious, and an ambiguous story requires a kind of confusing, mysterious, and ambiguous antagonist. And so in that sense, I think Koskov is an ideal villain for the universe that's being portrayed in The Living Daylights. Again, is it a Drax level or Stromberg level or Goldfinger level? No, it's not, but it doesn't have to be. But at the same time, I understand your reaction because I felt that way too. So, yeah, great. Let's see. So just keep scrolling down here because, let's see. Yes. Cooper Glover, 1972 says, Daisuke, if the immigration guy made them stop, the film would screech to a complete stop. Yes, I acknowledge that. Let's see. Just scrolling down here. That's interesting. Let's see. Yeah, X24 Rider makes reference to the film Rambo 3. Cooper Glover, 1972 says, Daisuke, do you prepare yourself for these streams? I mean, do you write out your thoughts about these films before you start a stream? No, I don't write out I don't have a script. Sometimes I have notes, but not always. Yes. Let's see. let's see. Right, let's see. Cooper Glover, 1972, says, so Daisuke, the Soviet Union and the Afghanis need each other. I didn't say that. They need each other. Let's see. Rico's here, hello. MBP is here, hello. Damn Full Idealist Crusader, hello. Yes, mentioning the circumstances surrounding Walter Gotell's, yes, and how his character had to be relegated to a minor role, and thus paving the way for Pushkin. Yes. Very well-known story. Thank you for bringing it up. Let's see. Just scrolling down, there's I made mention of Quantum of Solace, so I'm at the point in the lives chat where there's mentioning about Quantum of Solace. I think I do want to talk about Quantum of Solace one day. It's not my favorite Bond film, but it's not as bad as I thought it was when I saw it for the first time. It too, like License and like Living Daylights, has a great scene involving opera. I mentioned how this has Marriage of Figaro, and I love that reference to Marriage of Figaro because it seems very apropos in terms of, and in particular this film, how there's a lot of kind of like confusion and double cross upon double cross and who's who and what's going on and that sort of thing. And I always thought that the reference to Marriage of Figaro is very perfect. And the use of opera here is very perfect. And the use of opera in Quantum of Solace has a slightly different effect. It's more heightened, very stylized, but still, I think, equally as effective. So maybe one of these days I'd love to talk about Quantum of Solace. Let's see. Yes, and Cooper Glover 1972 talks also about the outro song, which is called "If There Was a Man," which is the romance, the kind of the romantic ballad of the film. You know, this is one of the things I really miss about John Barry's scoring, and this is the last John Barry score. And I know we're going a little bit over time, but I really must mention this, which is what John Barry did so well is he integrated his themes, whether they be the main song or the sub song or the closing song or whatever. Here we have essentially three songs: If There Was a Man, and Where Has Everybody Gone, and The Living Daylights. And I love how he integrates these themes and melodies and just makes them not isolated songs that are never heard of again, but they become part of the character of the film itself. And I really miss that about John Barry's scores. I mean, we see it a little bit with David Arnold's work, a little bit, but not to the extent that I think John Barry did it. And I think what John Barry does really well, and don't get me wrong, I love David Arnold's work, I really do, but one of the things I think that John Barry did incredibly well, that I really miss about the new Bond scores, is that he not only, there's this stuff about like a James Bond type of song, and lately it usually becomes a song that's in the minor key, and it usually is like this drawn out, kind of cold sounding song that seems like part of the Bond moment, because Bond films are now not as frequent in terms of their release schedules as they were, let's say, 20 years ago or so. But in past films we'd have songs that were ballads, songs that were in a major key, and things of that nature. Whereas now we don't get as much variety like that anymore, in my opinion. And so I really enjoy a film like The Living Daylights, because we have a kind of pop type of upbeat yet still minor key James Bond song at the beginning with Aha and The Living Daylights, but that carries through with a nice sub melody that has a nice major key element that really lifts the spirits, as it were. and that's used, for instance, in the sequence where Kara is driving the car next to the plane and she's waving James, James, and we hear the refrain from the Living Daylights song, which I think is really great. And of course, the other themes that are used are if there was a man, which is the romantic the romance theme that is meant to heighten the romantic scenes between Bond and Kara, and then also if there was where's everybody gone, which is the evil Necros theme. But I always love those integration of themes, leitmotifs, so seamlessly in John Barry's music, and this being the last John Barry score really makes that point. It drives it home, and that's not to take anything away from the other scores. I mean, they each have their own strengths, very much so. But there's just something very magical about this type of score in John Barry. Not to mention, of course, the fact that we have new, different types of orchestration of already tried and true versions of the James Bond theme, etc. And so, and use of new musical instruments and that sort of thing. So I find that stuff to be really endearing about this film. Yet another reason why I think this film is so worth it. Such a great one. All right, so let's see. And I love that line in the song, "Where is everybody gone?" What does he say? And the ashes of your memoirs will be strewn across the lawn. Oh, where else can you hear a line like that? I think that's such a great line. But let's see. Let's see. Annie Rose is here. Hello, it's nice to see you. I hope you're well, Annie. And let's see here. Let's see. All right. So there's talk here about Zay Moderno's here. Hello. Let's see. Let's see. Now there's discussion about Damnful Idealistic Crusaders' take on the film Casino Royale. I actually have a slightly different take than your take, Damnful Idealistic Crusader, but I think nothing nothing against your approach, my friend. Nothing at all. Let's see. Let's see. Laura Monolisk is here. Hello, it's nice to see you. R. Dobson is here as well. Hello. It's mentioning John Barry. So yes, just finished talking about him. Let's see. Let's see. Chandan Rao is here. Hello. It's nice to see you. And I hope if I skipped anyone's name here, I'm very sorry. David Pryor is here. Hello. And let's see. Okay, great. R. Dobson. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make sure I get everyone. Damnful Idealistic Crusader must be an atmospheric anomaly. I should say it. My Timothy Dalton impersonation is very bad, I admit, but I'll try to say it. Must be an atmospheric anomaly. Yes. So yes. And like even the way he hails a taxi in Vienna, he doesn't say he says taxi. I love that. That's and then the If There Was a Man theme plays the instrumental version, I think, right? Plays as that you see them strolling through the streets of Vienna. That's great. All right, and Damnful Idealistic Crusader says, has anyone else in times of strife used, we're on a Russian airbase in the middle of Afghanistan, and then, well, at least we're together. Terrific, clown school. Yeah. That's such a great line. Yeah, that's such a great, and that's so, what a lovely thing Kara would say, right? At least we're together. Gosh, that's such a lovely moment. It really is such a lovely moment. That's why I love Kara so much. What a great character she is. At least we're together. What a great moment. All right. Anyway, let's see. All right. I have I'm losing my voice because I think I've been speaking for about 3 hours plus. So, and it's now after 2 a.m. in the morning, and I must wake up. I don't have to wake up too early, but I still have to wake up in the morning. I do have some errands to run. So this concludes. Let me end the live stream now about the Living Daylights, and just say as a concluding comment from me that this is one of my favorites. This is one of my favorite Bond films. It's not just because of it's not just because of Timothy Dalton, although he's a big part of that. It's not just because of Mariam Dabo, although she's a big part of it. It's not just because of John Barry, although he's a big part of it. It's not just because of John Glenn's direction in certain scenes, although that's a big part of it. There are flaws, there are blemishes, there are imperfections to it. I get it. I absolutely get it. But there is something so special and so magical going on here. It's complicated, it's convoluted, but I think that's part of the point. It is new and fresh, maybe sometimes too new and too fresh, but I think that's also part of the point. It is also very delightful and fun, and yes, I think that is part of the point as well. This all comes together to create, in my eyes, a not just a brilliant debut, but a brilliant film period. It feels like a film that is Timothy Dalton is so strong, I would suggest, that it almost doesn't feel like a debut. It's like he's been doing this for a good couple films already, and he did The Living Daylights. It's that good, in my opinion. And so one of my favorites, my absolute favorites, and I'm so happy to have been able to talk with you just for a little bit about this. And so thank you very much for affording me this opportunity. I certainly enjoyed myself, and I in particular enjoyed hearing your thoughts about this. So thank you very much, as always. I will continue this. I haven't decided what the next one is. Again, I'm going in kind of a random order. We've done George Lazenby, we've done Timothy Dalton. I think I want to do I do want to go into either Sean Connery or Roger Moore next. So I haven't quite decided if it's Sean Connery. I don't know. It might be Thunderball or You Only Live Twice. I think. I'm not quite sure. If it's Roger Moore, I do want to talk about Moonraker. Or View to a Kill. I love Moonraker, and I love A View to a Kill very much. And so I love the opportunity to be able to talk about A View to a Kill. I can't quite defend Stacey Sutton and the blimp. I can't quite defend that moment, but everything else around that, I'd be very happy to talk about in positive, glowing terms. So maybe A View to a Kill next, although I haven't decided yet. I'll try to make my decision as soon as possible. And I'll make the announcement, and I'll try to give as much time as possible to give people enough time to watch the films, of course. So, but I'll certainly let you know. Again, I'm trying to space these out, but also try to go with a little bit of variety. As I say, I don't know if I'll be able to finish this project. I'll do my best, but in the under the possibility that I won't be able to finish the project, I do want to just, at the very least, go with one film from each of the Bonds, at least during this first go around. And so the idea is we've done George Lazenby and Timothy Dalton, and now let's do another one or Daniel Craig, and then we'll go from there. So, all right. So anyway, thank you very much, and take care, and I'll see you very soon. All right. Cheers, my friends.